conference. My name's Mary Reid, and I'll be chairing the session in place of Andrew Wiseman. And my aides for this debate are Jenny Rigg on stage and Zoe O'Connell in the hall. This is item F26, Employment in the 21st Century. You'll find the motion in the agenda pack on page 35. There is one amendment and there is one drafting amendment. That means the motion proposers agreed that that text will be added to the motion. And the amendments can be found in Conference Extra on page 18 and in today's Conference Daily on page 5. There will be an opportunity for interventions about halfway through the debate. Interventions are 1-minute speeches from the intervention mic, which is over there to my left to your right. If you wish to make an intervention, you do have to go to the speaker's table and fill in a short card, intervention card. You've got about 5 or 6 minutes to do that. We could fit in a few more, so if you would like to make an intervention, do it now. If we have more than we can take, the cards will be chosen at random. So we come to the debate. Would Scott Emery stand by? And I call Chris Fox to propose the motion.
Good afternoon, conference. One of the unknown to me fringe benefits of becoming a spokesperson on a topic for our party is I get the much sought after just after lunch slot to propose a motion. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. 21st century working is a huge topic, and it's clear there are massive changes coming down the line that will revolutionize the way that all of us work. This is not a speech that's going to talk about in detail the Industrial Revolution. All you have to do to get that is to stop me, and I'll give it to you, because I am very energized by the fact that as a country we have to embrace and get ready for this revolution that's coming. But it's actually a motion about changes that have already affected millions of Britons, and it's the leading edge of this revolution. So it's one that we have to think about now in readiness for even more changes that are going to come later. So to put employment into context, we absolutely should acknowledge that employment is at a virtual all-time high. More people have jobs, and there are fewer registering as unemployed. But of course, many of those people are still earning what they were earning at the time of the industrial crash. In other words, the financial crash. In other words, they're earning a lot less. And there are other things that have been cut for many of those people too. Security, certainty, and peace of mind are all less for many workers. Now, one of the drivers of this sense of insecurity has been laid at the door of the so-called gig economy. Now, this is one of the most noticeable and revolutionary changes to the job market that has happened for many, many years. Put simply, as I'm sure you know, there are an increasing number of market-specific services that are delivered by an army of people who are not the direct employees of the company selling those services. This has largely been driven by innovative digital platforms that connect customers directly with the service providers. You pay the platform, they pay the provider. At best, this offers both consumer choice and worker autonomy. It benefits small, innovative startups that might not be able to afford many full-time employees, while making it easier for employees and individuals to decide when they work. And surveys do show that this flexibility is valued, not just by the businesses, but also by many employees. But the benefits of this gig economy shouldn't blind us to the challenges. A framework of employment rights, regulations and protections that has been built up over decades is failing to address this new way of working. This is vividly illustrated by a recent wave of court cases launched on behalf of so-called gig economy workers. The current employment framework is unfit for purpose. Existing laws are not equipped to deal with this type of modern employment. Meanwhile, the enforcement of those laws that are still relevant is undermined by prohibitive tribunal fees and weak enforcement mechanisms. So this has to change, which is what this motion is about. The Liberals are pro-business and pro-innovation. So this is not a wrecking legislation, because we believe that the strongest businesses are those that truly work in partnership with all of their stakeholders, including their employees. And for this to happen, there has to be a fair deal for workers. In government, thanks to Vince, we legislated to stop zero-hours employers demanding exclusivity from their workers. And that was a big change, very important. And we shouldn't underestimate the difference that that has made to people's lives. Looking forward, however, technology must not be used to undermine employment rights, individual freedom, and the well-being that comes from security. So moving forward, our 2017 manifesto commits us to scrapping tribunal fees, to strengthening worker participation in company decision-making, and giving zero-hours workers the right to request a fixed contract. I think we'd all agree those are steps forward. But more must be done if we are to develop a framework where all those at work can benefit from this 21st century innovation, this industrial revolution. That's why we welcomed the recent review of modern employment conducted by Matthew Taylor. That's not our Matthew Taylor, it's the other Matthew Taylor, okay? And if you remember, don't get your Matthew Taylors muddled up. The report introduces some ways of addressing the issues, and this motion includes many of the recommendations that came out through the findings of the Taylor report. There are some key changes that would help restore the balance of power between workers and employers in the modern economy. Those include ensuring that existing employment legislation is fit for purpose and making sure existing employment categories accurately reflect the nature of modern work. Now, that might seem an arcane issue, but we need to know if someone is an employee, is a genuine freelancer, independent freelancer, or something in between. And it's that something in between which is currently the grey area which we're talking about now. So we need to understand and have proper definitions of those roles, and then we need legal tests so that people can actually prove which of those categories there are. There is no point having rights around certain employment categories if it is impossible or very difficult to prove which of those categories you actually are when you're a worker. New laws, no matter how well designed, are only as good as their enforcement, and this needs to be strengthened, and employers should bear the burden of proof in employment tribunals given their greater strength. Supporting the development of novel forms of worker representation should also be part of our aim, and novel forms of finance. It's very difficult to get mortgages and finance if you have this kind of employment. There needs to be new financial instruments to support them. Conference, I expect there to be motions in the future that will deal with this. The policy-making process is at hand, and I think this is the start of a process. However, these reforms will play an important part in the start of that process. I ask Conference to back the motion and support the amendments. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris is our Shadow Secretary of State for Business and Industrial Strategy. Could Pippa Morgan please stand by, and I now call Scott Emery to move the Amendment 1.
Hello, Conference. This is my first time speaking at Federal. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to start by saying that I believe this motion is very well written and goes into good detail about the benefits and issues surrounding zero-hours contracts. I hope the Liberal Democrats can go forward in support of the new types of jobs that are being created in the last few years. Matthew Taylor was appointed by Theresa May last October to review employment practices in the light of concerns about the precarious nature of work, specifically zero-hours contracts. Taylor said in the report that the government should ask the Low Pay Commission, the LPC, in its remit to advise on the impact of bringing in a higher minimum wage for hours which are not guaranteed in a contract. The Taylor report has been said to have been accepted by the digital platform companies such as Uber, with an industry source saying that they aren't too tough. This amendment the Young Liberals and I are proposing would see companies have to pay an increased rate above the minimum wage if they called upon workers whose contracts do not guarantee hours. This would give firms an incentive to guarantee more hours in advance because it would cost them more to pay people for work that had not already been agreed. It's very easy to talk about how these are good for people who work in freelance, for instance, while ignoring the large amounts of young people who enter the job market into unskilled jobs and get exploited by businesses who cancel hours at a moment's notice. No guarantee of work can make for a very precarious existence. If you need to pay your rent and bills and told at a little notice that there will be no shifts for you this week, budgeting can be nigh on impossible. Zero-hours contracts can be beneficial for some, but unequal power relations and insecurity can cause harm to some employees. Young people on zero-hours contracts, for instance, are 1.5 times more likely to report having a mental health problem. Someone on a more secure employment than someone on a more secure employment contract. If you are worried that this would distort the labour market, the LPC have experience in this regard to implementing the minimum wage without raising unemployment or affecting job markets. This amendment and motion is what the Liberal Democrats are all about. The Tories wouldn't touch zero-hours contracts, they wouldn't go near them. And Labour would lack the nuance and they would bludgeon them all out of existence. Employers should not have both the luxuries and flexibility and low pay while workers struggle to make ends meet. This amendment allows for some of the imbalance to be resolved. So to finish, don't allow things to continue as they are. Don't wait for things to get better. Be the future you want to see. Please support the amendment and the motion as amended. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Could Alison Bennett stand by? And I now call Pippa Morgan.
The world of work is changing rapidly with automation, new business models, technology platforms. And by one popular estimate, this is perhaps best summed up by the fact that around 65% of primary school children now will go into jobs that don't currently exist. And it's those kind of stats that make this debate about the future of work quite frightening, as well as highlighting some of the real opportunities that there are. And as Liberal Democrats, we want to strike the right balance. We want to be pro-enterprise and we want to be pro-worker. If you're Jeremy Corbyn, you'd ban flexible employment, but you then stand on a Glastonbury stage, which is cleaned by the very people on those kind of contracts. Or you're the Tories, and we know from Vince and others about the kind of things that they tried to get through in coalition to strip down our framework of employment rights, and which was successfully blocked by Liberal Democrats. So I'm speaking in support of the motion and the amendment today, because I think, actually, these recognise that balance. Huge change has taken place that the law hasn't kept up with. Actually, there's this massive gap between self-employment and employment. The motion's suggestions of setting thresholds, as well as the new dependent contractor status, would help start to fill that gap in which all kinds of sectors and job types and individuals now find themselves. But I think we need to treat this as a start. So today is the beginning of a massive debate. Actually, this is about the floor of rights that we have in the UK, but there's a much broader conversation for us as a party about what work is like, about what support people need, the skills, the career training that they require to navigate this new world. The motion hints at that when it talks about the new kind of financial products that are going to be needed. And I think that's particularly true for young people as they leave university, as they want to try and buy a house, and they're trying to work their way through this complex jobs market. Sheryl Sandberg, who's the Chief Operating Officer of Facebook, talked about careers changing from ladders to jungle gyms. And I think that's quite accurate, and it's probably something that we all know from our lives today. I think, as I say, I think this motion is a start for us as a party to help people navigate that world. It's a big and a complex question, but I urge you to support it, the motion as amended. Thank you.
Thank you. That was Pippa's first speech at conference. I'll ask Andrew Hudson to stand by. I now call Alison Bennett.
Thank you and good afternoon, conference. This is also my first time speaking at conference. And May 2017 was another first for me when I stood as a candidate to be a county councillor. I mention this because a key factor in deciding whether to stand was if I could fit the work of a county councillor around the demands of raising a young family. The answer was yes. Meetings are during school hours. Casework can be handled flexibly, and the council does not meet in August. Whilst this motion focuses upon technical and legal changes to protect workers in the 21st century economy, it neglects one group who are at the sharp end of new working practices, namely women. Inequality in the workplace, be it the gender pay gap, the glass ceiling or maternity discrimination, are well documented, but women are more likely to be employed in low-paid, part-time and insecure work. Whilst these forms of working may be convenient, it would be a mistake to assume that this is what people employed in this way would ideally choose. I know Cambridge graduates working as part-time teaching assistants, financial services professionals taking cash in hand cleaning houses, a friend running her own marketing agency earning very little relative to the time put in. The preponderance of professional women working in this way is not a sign of a flourishing entrepreneurial economy, but evidence that the traditional economy is failing to adapt to the needs of modern families. More imaginative solutions do exist. Last week, a ripple of surprise greeted the news that The Spectator had a new intern, a 48-year-old mother of 3. As Lib Dems, we should be asking ourselves what we can do to make ideas like returnships a commonplace route back to secure, meaningful and well-paid work. Please support this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Would Laura Gordon stand by? I now call Andrew Hudson, who is going to speak against the motion.
A few weeks ago, John Snow gave the McTaggart lecture, pointing out how out of touch the media was with a lot of people. This motion shows how out of touch we have become. Lines 12 to 14. Are you serious? Try telling that to a young person working a 0 hours contract. No wonder they're flocking to Jezza. I'm only glad that I'm now retired and not at the start of my working life. 16 to 17 is not an ambiguity raised by some modern work. It is reality for a lot of people. Unfortunately, it is bogus self-employment that is becoming increasing reality, and it's here that the pay gap is at its worst, and it's effectively its return of the system known as a lump that used to apply on building sites. Lines 9 to 40 that apply to some people, a lot of people are better off, particularly if their taxation is dealt with offshore. Most people aren't. A few people were better off under lump, usually a minority of people like highly skilled electricians on building sites. Most people are not going to be entrepreneurs. We all need to employ someone to be entrepreneurs. The right to request formal rights doesn't mean a lot if you're afraid to exercise it. As with Share Champion, the word some has not been used where it should be, and where it has been used, it's been used in the wrong place. For a lot of self-employed people, it's neither extreme, but it's not a bed of roses. Most of conference calls for I largely agree with, but 9:54 to 5 are whistling the dark. You can call for government institutions to act, but the public will support what it wants to support, whether conference calls for it or not. In the case of unions, they will develop new forms or they will decline. They have thankfully adopted in the case of recruiting migrant workers, women, etc. In fact, the only best way to get your rights enforced in work is to be a member of a union. Workers' cooperatives will be fairly limited, probably not appropriate for transient employment. There's also a case of, I call them bogus workers' cooperatives, in that shared ownership isn't the same thing. For instance, the John Lewis Partnership, though Dutch credit is never claimed to be workers' cooperative. But one of the absences, I mentioned migrant workers, yet they're likely to be part of the workforce for some time to come, and that includes unskilled as well as skilled workers, like the hospitality industry, like farm workers and a lot of others. So, unfortunately, the motion is not going far enough to tackle abuses, so I have to ask you to vote against it.
Thank you, Andrew. Could Neil Lewis stand by? And I call Laura Gordon, who wishes to speak for amendment number 1.
Thank you for calling me. I would like to speak for amendment number 1. And I would like to support the amendment by telling you about my positive experiences with 0 hours contracts. I had a 0 hours contract for a period of time with an international NGO, and that 0 hours contract enabled me to deploy quickly if there was an emergency somewhere around the world. And it meant that, you know, if there was an earthquake or whatever, I didn't have to go and fill in payroll forms before I went and got on a plane to help people with the earthquake. My husband had a 0 hours contract. He is a doctor. He worked for the NHS. And that meant that when he took a career break, he could pick up a couple of shifts here and there at our local hospital. He could keep his skills up. And they got to have a locum doctor that was cheaper than having to go through an agency. 0 hours contracts can work. When there are both sides benefiting from the flexibility, they work. They work when they are an option for people. Where they don't work and where we see them having been overused is where they are used as the only option, where they are used because employers can't be bothered to plan properly and where they want to keep their workforce insecure. Another member of my family also had a 0 hours contract with Sports Direct, and that was a much less positive experience. We've seen all of the problems, you know, anyone who's read a newspaper has seen the problems that came up with Sports Direct. You know, people showing up for work and finding their shift has been cancelled, complaining, not getting any more hours. You're being kept after work, and, well, that's not a 0 hours contracts problem, that's just an abuse problem, but, you know, being kept late and not being paid for the time. So 0 hours contracts are overused. We need to restrict their use. We need them to be used less. And Amendment 1, I think, does that. It gives employers a strong incentive to only use 0 hours contracts when they actually need the flexibility. And when they don't use the flexibility, then there is an incentive to give people a regular contract. This amendment is an inherently liberal response to a problem that our employment market is currently producing. It's not a Labour right solution that would, clunking fist, ban the contracts altogether, even though they work for some people, including our NHS. There's not a Tory approach that would let the employers keep exploiting people for as long as they like because, yay, profit is great. It's a liberal approach that treats people like grown-ups. It compensates people who might want some flexibility in their lives or might not mind. It compensates them for the inconvenience with higher wages. It gives employers the option of having a flexible labour force if that's what they want, but they have to pay for it. And it treats people and it treats employers like grown-ups. Please vote for Amendment 1 and please support the motion as amended.
Thank you, Laura. After our next speaker, we'll be moving to the interventions. And so I'd like these people to make their way over to the mic in this order. Jonathan Hunt, Kevin Dawes, Alistair Calder-McGregor, Angela Robinson, Bob Wheatcroft, Simon Horseman, and Catherine Morrish. So I now call Neil Lewis to speak.
Good afternoon. There is good policy and there's great policy. And I support this motion because it is good policy that brings up to date employment law for the reality of how work is. When I went to work about 30 years ago, I went expecting a portfolio career. I know that as my children in a few years enter their world of work, then actually the gig economy will be much more important. But I want to draw out a couple of things about how we can, as we accept and vote to take this forward as a policy discussion, actually make this excellent policy. And I think the first one is to recognize that a gig economy works well when there are plenty of gigs. when there's plenty of opportunities, plenty of flexibility, where there are start-up roles, there are growth opportunities, and there are full-time roles altogether. The challenge that we have as a country, not least because of Brexit, but nevertheless still there, is that I believe that our economy is more hollowed out, more rusted and more busted than anyone is accepting or acknowledging. And we must address that fundamental issue, and I think some of the previous speakers did so, and I think Lord Fox also acknowledged that this is a platform paper. But what I want to see is alongside this paper, a Liberal Democrat view, a vision for the future of a vibrant economy in which each person can take and find what they need to find to help them deliver the very best and become the best that they can be. I also want to address the issue of apprenticeships, because we recognise as a party the importance of apprenticeship. There is no better apprenticeship for business than starting a business and beginning to innovate. It is a great path forward. And yet we do not encourage young businesses. We have not addressed that. The policy rightly talks about size on line 63, so it acknowledges that large companies should be held to different standards than small companies. I suggest that we should also think about young companies, companies under the age of 5 who create the majority of net growth in jobs. That then also gives a path for young people, and it also allows those young people to actually start to tackle some of the wealth inequality in our economy. I believe it's the role of the Liberal Democrats to bring this economy. I think only we can do it. Only we can create that vision. I think we can offer a brighter future, a greater hope for young people and also the rest of us who are returning to work or continue to work and want to find opportunities and flexibilities together. And lastly, I'd ask you to vote for the amendment that flexibility for an employer should cost more, and that's why someone who is on very flexible hours should be able to earn more per hour. I think that's an excellent amendment. So please support the motion, but also let's create a vibrant economic vision for the future alongside it. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. After the interventions, I will be calling Sarah Brown from Manchester, and we now move over to the intervention mic. Jonathan Hunt.
Conference. Some are born to become self-employed, others choose to become self-employed, but far too many are having self-employment thrust upon them, often under protest. As a journalist by trade, I've experienced both at different times, mainly willingly, but that was when the taxman applied tough conditions to being allowed to have that, that status and some tax advantages. These included having to prove that you decide how to perform the task designated by the employer. That may be fine for hacks, but rarely applies to zero-hour workers at far too many tax-avoiding multinationals. You know who they are, those who fully exploit the full so-called gig economy.
I'm afraid the mics go off automatically after a minute. Not my doing. Kevin Dawes.
Thank you, Chair. Like many people in this room, I'm a trade unionist, and I believe in applying Liberal Democrat principles in the workplace, and I call that community politics in the workplace, where I involve people, I survey them, I get them engaged, and they make a valuable contribution both to the union and to the workplace in improving conditions. That's the type of new unionisation that I'd like to see, and I'd like to see the party support through this motion when it comes back in spring. Can I make one brief comment? The tribunal fees, we've gotten a clarification, but I was surprised that the mover didn't actually make the point that through a trade union case taken to Supreme Court, these tribunal fees were thrown out.
Thank you. Next, Alistair Calder-McGregor.
Thank you, Chair. Conference, this motion is to be massively welcomed. As a contractor, I have long had to deal with the overcomplicated and entirely, chaining the effects of the IR35 legislation brought in by Gordon Brown and the Labour government. I strongly urge you, Conference, to accept this motion in order to get rid of those and adopt the dependent contractor status, which will free small businesses from the invidious effects of IR35 and free the contractors for better working practices. I would also very much encourage you to adopt the amendment because, frankly, we should be adopting the entirety of the Taylor report, as it is an excellent report and should form the basis of employment policy in this country. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Angela Robinson.
There's a surprising gap in the content of these issues around the subject of employment. It's the right to shared free time, the concept of social hours, that is the hours you spend in evenings and weekends with your family and friends, with your hobbies, and in community functions like choirs, drama groups, council meetings, church meetings, sports, entertainment outside the home, rehearsals, and even just going for a walk or ride. This has revolutionized family and community life in the last 50 years. Sunday in particular and bank holidays were times in which your employer had to get off your back. You had the right not to work, unless in REST, recreation, emergencies, social gatherings, and the travelling public were, of course, the exceptions. I loved going into the butchers on Keep Sunday Special or other family business that depended on Sunday to do their work. No wonder these family businesses have had to go out of work. Sunday was the day when they did their books.
Thank you. I'm afraid the mic's gone off. Next, Bob Wheatcroft.
I would like to speak in particular support of lines 49 to 52. This is where the motion talks about some objective tests for determining the difference between different types of employment status. Because at the moment that can be very, very difficult indeed. As those of you who will have followed the Uber case through the courts, and indeed others will have seen, it can also be very expensive. And that puts a barrier to those who don't have particularly deep pockets. So, but the use of some objective tests should quicken the procedure, should make it easier for individuals and the revenue where appropriate to fight the status. And it is important that the tax treatment also follows the employment law state treatment, which is not obvious, but absolutely vital. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Next, Simon Horseman.
Good afternoon. Broadly, I support the motion, but there seems to be a gap in respect of taxation. In fact, 3 of the interventions have touched on it, including the one on IR35. I guess most of us are staying in hotels. Maybe some of us are staying courtesy of Airbnb. How can a hotel compete when it has to pay 20% VAT and, 13% national insurance, perhaps, for a lot of its staff? Therefore, I propose either that VAT on services be abolished, and that's a big change involving a rippling through the whole of the tax structure, or we can say to Airbnb through your platform, by the way, you're going to have to pay 20% VAT on the lot that goes to HMRC to somewhat equalise the matter. It's a big issue, lots to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you. And Catherine Morrish.
Could I ask the movers to add to number 5 on line 58 of page 37, preventing cuts in earnings and contributory pensions already agreed in law, causing a serious loss of nurses in the NHS and teachers in schools. It is my personal belief it is criminal for ministers or anyone to cut previously agreed wages of public servants, causing not only possible loss of money, but their home and the need for food banks. And what is even worse, NHS and education managers are using up valuable NHS and schools money on administration. This must be prevented. Teachers have lost money over the last 7 years and up to £3,000 a year in some cases.
Thank you. Thank you for all the interventions. Could Lucy Salek stand by? I now call Sarah Brown, who is going to speak 4, lines 64 to 66.
Conference. I want to talk to you about pensions and financial education. Before you fall asleep, though, I work in a HR department in higher education establishment where I work in the pensions and reward team. The pensions that I work with, they're great, but the schemes are just not prepared for short-term contracts and the gig economy. Many simply refund contributions that are made after short-term contracts, even if you're even enrolled into the scheme if you're on a gig economy contract. That means that gig economy and short-term workers will find it hard to build up nest eggs for their retirement. We need our pension schemes to be flexible to allow these workers to build for their future. I also want to touch on what the motion refers to as financial products. I think that one that should be included here is financial education. Early, mid and pre-retirement planning are not common enough in workplaces, but they're vital for the financial well-being of workers. Many workers find the complexities of getting mortgages, deciding which pension scheme is best for them, or how best to save for their future quite a minefield. Some find it hard to even just budget. Many employees end up in financial dire straits, and they can end up just worried or, at worst, suffering from mental ill health and disengagement in their jobs. Conference, let's look together at pensions and financial education to make them work for all workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Could Jason Brown please stand by? I now call Lucy Salek, who wishes to speak against the motion.
Thank you and good afternoon, Conference. There wasn't an option to tick abstain on the card, so I'm actually considering abstaining against this motion. I'm speaking as someone who decided to become self-employed 6 months ago and set up my own business. I pretty much agree with nearly everything that's been said so far in the debate, which is always unusual, and I like all of the things that have been listed in the policy motion. However, I feel pretty much the same about this policy as I do about the Taylor Review. I really like it, but I was left a bit disappointed at the end. Since Conference has started, I have heard over and over and over again how we have to become the party of big ideas and new thinking and that ever overused word radical. What we're looking at in the policy is a series of small fixes which are important, and I have no objections to any of them, but what we're missing is the big idea. It's missing the way in which it connects with the fact that our current economy, the way in which we understand and undertake employment, the way in which we structure everything is just not fit for the future. We need to think bigger, bolder, and much more connected, and that's why I will be abstaining from this policy motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Could Katie Gordon stand by? And I call Jason Brown, who wishes to speak for Amendment 1.
Hello, Conference. I work in the gig economy, and I'm speaking in favour of the amendment and the motion as a whole. Now, I'm often told we shouldn't change how the gig economy works, because workers in it report higher levels of job satisfaction. And I confess I very much enjoy my job, largely because as a courier of food, I get to ride my bicycle for a living and claim I'm a professional athlete. I do not, however, appreciate that the company I'm dependent upon is controlling, uncommunicative, and uncaring towards its workers. That I still enjoy my job doesn't mean there aren't legitimate concerns. And that is a far more representative of the experiences I've heard from talking to other workers. To illustrate the way that workers can be treated, last winter when the roads were icy and wet, there were several crashes. One in particular, I remember, someone had to be taken to hospital, and when the company headquarters were told, their first response was, "How's the food?" So in particular, I praise the amendment because it may actually encourage them to value their workers. And I want to challenge this notion that the status quo is inherently more flexible. This was declared to be fiction by the Parliamentary Committee for Work and Pensions in the publication they had last April. They added, self-employment is genuinely flexible and rewarding for many, but people on employment contracts can and do work flexibly. Flexibility is not the preserve of poorly paid, unstable contractors. Now, I'm glad the motion draws from the Taylor Review and agrees that the gig economy workers are neither self-employed nor employed, but dependent contractors, because the companies do hold significant power. And it's hard to challenge poor use of this power when you're self-employed, so I also welcome the motion's support for new forms of unionization. Now, there have been slow changes as a result of legal effort, but currently it only changes one company at a time. So I agree with the motion that HMRC should be encouraged to exercise greater enforcement of rights, and we should have stricter legislation on worker status. Finally, it's often overlooked that self-employment is not covered by the usual discrimination laws as employment is. When I started, the informal guidance for assessment of potential riders was to pass them as you see fit, unless they were a woman, in which case you should pass them if they were good looking. This was not protected under usual employment discrimination laws because it was not employment. It is clear that our legislation is outdated, and we can protect against exploitation while allowing for growth and innovation. Please support the motion and the amendment.
Thank you, and Jason was a first-time speaker as well. Could Arya Babu stand by? And I call Katie Gordon, who's going to speak about lines 73 to 74.
It is vital to individuals and the health of our economy that everyone feels they have realistically attainable ways to strengthen their future job prospects. That is one of the 7 principles of fair and decent work for all that Matthew Taylor outlined in his recent review of employment practices. Until recently, I ran a university career service in Scotland. Now I run one in London. I've been reflecting on the differences in employment support structures between Scotland and England. With new types of employment, new industries, and new challenges to workers' rights, how do we prepare people to navigate what is an increasingly uncertain world? Young people entering the job market are uniquely vulnerable to exploitation as they don't have the history of work experience to recognize a bad job offer or the confidence to challenge poor practice. We need to help people recognize their skills and their value to employers. This builds confidence that they can get a job elsewhere if they are mistreated by their current employer. And this starts with understanding what you want from work, how that fits with your skills, your experience, and your aspirations. Having a clear career plan builds motivation, determination, and focus. But we also need to teach people how to respond to career setbacks and to have the resilience to cope with unexpected changes in their working lives, how to respond to zero-hours contracts, the gig economy, and bogus self-employment. The key to help young people develop these skills and resilience is the school career service. Careers advisors are the experts in helping young people think about their careers, decide what they want to do, and how to go about it. They bring a wealth of knowledge about the labour market and how to find your place within it. And yet what has happened in England in recent years is a betrayal of our young people. Governments of all stripes, Labour, Tories, and even, sadly, the Coalition, have decimated the career service in schools across the country. I see it daily at university, young people coming to start their courses with no idea how their studies relate to their future career plans. But at least students can use their university career service. What happens to the 60% who don't go to university? We are leaving them more vulnerable, just at the point when they need most support. We need to give our young people the tools to succeed in this uncertain world. I support this motion and the amendment, but we must rebuild a statutory career service in England as we still have in Scotland.
Thank you, Katie. Could Richard Flowers please stand by? I call Arya Babu, who is a first-time speaker, who is speaking for the motion as a whole.
Afternoon, conference. So there's this really great Douglas Adams quote that says something along the lines of, everything that existed in the world before you were born is just natural. It's the way everything's always been. Everything that's invented between the age of 15 and 35, it's new and it's exciting and maybe you can get a job in it. And everything that's invented after you're 35 is unnatural. It's just not the way the world works. My grandparents are both Labour Party members, and they really, really like to talk about how bad the gig economy is at me. And they like to tell me, you know, that Uber is dangerous and that zero-hour contracts are destroying our country. And I just repeat Douglas Adams back at them and then go to the kitchen. But I think there's something really interesting in that, and I can see why people have a lot of anxiety when they look out at the world and they see that the things that have kept them safe in the past are no longer there for them, because employment is different. But from my perspective, like, I went into the jobs market when it looked like this. This is how it's meant to work. I really love the flexibility that my zero-hours contract gave me when I was 19. It was really, really useful. I probably wouldn't have gotten a job as a waitress otherwise. I had no experience, and it was very competitive at the time. And as a result, I was given the chance to get some experience, and then my salary went up, and I started to get more hours. And I think that's a really useful way of helping young people access a really competitive job market, as it is right now. If you make a system where people get to have choice, for example, and this is why I think as Liberals, we really should be in support of the gig economy, really should be in support of zero-hour contracts, and we really should be just enthusiastic about them, because it gives people autonomy over their lives. The big difference now is that people can choose, instead of working as a taxi driver for a company that mandates your hours, they can now choose when they want to work in terms of Uber. They can reject calls that send them really far away, and they can choose to work you know, maybe when their children aren't at home and that kind of thing. And I think that's the kind of thing we should really celebrate. We should be optimistic about that, and I think this motion is a good step towards us embracing the future of work. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Aria. Could Susan Kramer please stand by, and I call Richard Flowers, who particularly wants to talk about lines 68 to 72.
As Liberals, we want to help workers make the most out of their employment. Jobs are changing. The gig economy is just the start. The rise of the robots, AI, driverless vehicles, these are all going to change the nature of work for millions of people. And workers' rights are changing too, particularly if Brexit is going to happen. So it is vital that we as a party are looking forward to the economy as it changes, so that we can support people as they find the new opportunities for themselves. I think Lucy was right when she said that we need to find more big ideas, but I think Neil actually had it better when he said this is a good basis for that, and we have an economy paper coming so we can see how it develops. But I particularly want to support the changes to universal benefit, which are in line 68 to 72, to make it a benefit that truly works to make work work. We had a good emergency motion this morning tackling the failings of implementation, but we need to take it further so that power lies with the workers, so that employees have the rights and employers have to do the right thing to keep their workers working for them. In the last year, we've seen an increase in the number of people, sometimes surprising people in business, talking about a universal citizens' income. I know our working group looked at that last year, and we couldn't support it at that time. But I think we can see in this motion the start of a path that will take us towards some of the benefits of those ideas, giving the power to the individual so they are not enslaved by dependence on one employer. These are good liberal ideas. This motion is about the future of jobs. It's about giving people freedom to make the most of their employment. It's about fairness, so that the benefits of work go to the people doing that work. I think it's a great motion. I think the amendment is terrific too. Please support them both. Thank you.
We have not had any speakers against the amendment, so that does not need to be summated. But I call Susan Kramer now to summate for the motion as a whole.
Conference, I thank you. What an outstanding series of speeches we've had. I think if ever I've been in a debate when a summator was unnecessary, it's one like this, where there's been so much clarity and so many good ideas. And can I say how extraordinary the number of first-time speakers, I think we must have had at least 5, and the number of younger people. Now, admittedly, my version of younger is, are they younger than my children? But I think well over the majority of those who've spoken today, it's the new energy of the party, it's the people who work in the economy, who are the future, who carry the burdens of the future, who are taking over our conference and our party, and I couldn't be more excited and thrilled. So can I say with this motion, I mean, I think everyone has gathered, this is not a be-all and end-all motion, this is a step on the road. The economy has been changing, the gig economy is a reality. And we heard two sides of the coin in quite a number of the speeches today. I think the person who crystallized some of its benefits for us was Arya, but Pippa also talked about this changing world of work. That I really want to thank Scott and the Young Liberals and Jason, who spoke along the same lines, that for the amendment that deals with some of the issues around balance of power, and which we very much accepted into this motion. That, but I also want to say to quite a number, and I guess Laura also talked about some of the positives as well as the negatives. But can I also say there were quite a number of speakers pointed out what isn't in the motion, and I couldn't agree with them more. There are areas around taxation, pensions, entrepreneurship, financial education. Sarah talked about that. Career advice, that's from Katie, and I absolutely agree with her that we decimated our career guidance system at our peril, quite frankly. But all of these issues that have been brought forward, gender equality, that's in the workplace, all of those are real, all of them need work. But we are at the beginning of a process, and I'm proud of the party for beginning to take the right and important steps, because essentially what it does is this motion looks at the system and it basically tries to make sure that employment rights, tax, some aspects of pensions, universal credit are adapted to make sure that this new way of working is not abusive of people who are out in the modern workforce. But there's much more to do. We are at the cusp of a great deal of fundamental change. That's artificial intelligence, the fourth industrial revolution, robotics will, in the very near future, already are changing the way we work, but there will be dramatic changes coming. And we have as a party to keep up with that, in fact, to stay slightly ahead of the curve if we can. And to the many people who raised issues that they want to follow up on, we've got a series of working groups. If corporate tax exercises you as it did some of our speakers today, we have a task force looking exactly at business taxes to try and make it fit for today, which is and for this modern sort of global world and digital world that we have. If the 21st century economy interests you, we have a major workforce looking at that. Many of the issues that are addressed within this motion fall within its remit, but it goes much broader than that. We are at a time when we are developing that vision and the new thinking that quite a number of people called for, that we ought to be delivering as a party. But so look at this motion as a significant step. It's a down payment, if you like, on making the changes that we need. The other two parties are not seriously addressing these issues. We are, so join with us, help us build this vision, and I hope you will support both this amendment, both this motion and the amendments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. We will now come to the vote, so please have your voting card ready with the voting side faced towards me. And we'll first take a vote on the amendment, on Amendment 1. Would all those in favour of Amendment 1 please show your cards now? Thank you. And all those against Amendment 1, please show. It's just a handful, but that amendment is clearly carried. And now we will vote on the motion as a whole and amended by that amendment. Would all those in favour of the motion as a whole please show? Thank you. And all those against the motion, please show. Again, I can just see a handful voting against, so that motion has been carried. Can I thank all the speakers, and apologies to those we weren't able to call, and a special thanks to Jenny Rigg and to Zoe O'Connell, my aides. Thank you.
If you could leave as quickly as possible, please. Thank you. Thank you. We now move to F27, which is on page 38, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome to the stage Willie Rennie, MSP, leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats.
Thank you very much, Liz. I have good news for you, good news from Scotland. Last year, in the Scottish Parliament elections, we won seats back from the SNP and won massive majorities in the Northern Isles. In May, we won seats on Scottish councils and now have a hand in running 4 councils, including Argyll and Bute, led by our very own Aileen Morton. And in June, we went further and secured victory in Edinburgh West with Christine Jardine, in Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross with Jamie Stone, Eastern Bartonshire with Joe Swinson, who's just arrived in the room, and Alistair Carmichael is back with a big swing and an even bigger majority. 3 new members of Parliament, or as I prefer to describe it, quadrupling. With just 2 more votes in North East Fife, 2 votes, Elizabeth Riches would have joined that wonderful team of winning members of Parliament. Elizabeth, thank you for your work ethic and your dignity. You are a credit to our party. So now a third of the Liberal Democrat team of members of Parliament are Scots. In fact, half of all our UK parliamentarians in Cardiff, London and Edinburgh are Scots. The Deputy Leader and the Chief Whip are Scots. Some say the Scots are coming, but I'm afraid they're wrong. We're already here. It has been suggested that we should reform the Barnett formula to reflect the new Scottish share, but I can assure you that as long as I lead the Scottish Liberal Democrats, we will respect the minority that is the Liberal Democrats in England. So we won seats in Holyrood, we run more councils, and we have more MPs, and we did it with a positive agenda, to invest in people and with complete clarity against independence. This time, we won, we put the amorous pigs behind us. Instead, we got the help of a couple of boisterous rams and slightly confused alpacas to help us win. The SNP have at last recognised that people do not want another independence referendum. It is 3 years to the day since the last one. The SNP have cooled on the idea, and that is thanks to everyone who campaigned and voted for the Liberal Democrats. People who voted for us in June can see the positive results already. And thanks to the Liberal Democrats, the SNP are on their way out too. They're going to lose the next election, and it is not before time too. They used to boast about team record vision. It is why they say they won the 2011 election. For those unfamiliar with the performance of the SNP government, let us look at that mantra now. The vision. That was independence, and it is gone, at least for now. The team, and I think it's widely recognised they have the weakest team of cabinet ministers since devolution. And record. Scottish education used to be the pride of the nation. It was seen across the world as the gold standard. Now it has slipped down the international rankings. Scottish policing used to operate with public consent. Local forces connected to their communities. Crime levels at a record low. Now it is in complete turmoil. It's been through 2 chairmen, a chief executive, a chief constable, and its second chief has stepped aside. And that's just in 4 years. The NHS is something Scots cherish. It's part of our very being. But now people wait for weeks to see a GP, consultant vacancies are growing, and we're short of nurses. And waits for young people needing mental health support are up to 2 whole years. On education, on police, on health, their record is not something to crow about. They have no vision, a weak team and a poor record. By the SNP's very own test, they are failing. They are spending more time obsessing about power and control than delivering on health, on crime, and on education. People are fed up waiting on the SNP to deliver on their promises. And they will tell them, loud and clear, your time is up. After 14 years, the SNP will lose next time. The big question is, what comes next? This month marks 20 years since Scotland voted to create the Scottish Parliament. It was a parliament that great Liberals such as Malcolm Bruce, Ming Campbell, Ray Meahy and David Steele led the charge for. The Scottish Parliament has Liberal foundations of which we should all be proud. We did not just make the Scottish Parliament, we made it work for Scotland too. With Jim Wallace, we formed the first Scottish Government. We certainly had a reforming zeal. And so many of those ideas were Liberal ideas. I still recall Labour turning up to negotiations after the first elections with a thin letter asking if we'd like to join a Labour government. Boy, they were arrogant at that time. Not so much now. We rejected that idea and insisted on imprinting Liberal Democrats onto every page of a joint programme for government. And together, we achieved so much. Free bus passes for pensioners, ambitious renewable energy targets, the abolition of Scotland's Section 28, a boost to teachers' pay and conditions, free personal care for elderly people, free dental and eye checkups, free tuition for Scottish students, nursery education for 3- and 4-year-olds, new schools and new hospitals, an ambitious land reform programme, including the abolition of feudalism, secured status for the Gaelic language, formed NHS 24, and proportional representation for local government. This was an active government, focused on the day job, not distracted by independence, determined to deliver change for the long term, not calculating everything for short-term advantage. That is what government's about. That is what the Liberal Democrats are about. Just like in 1999, we will be ready for change that will come next time. Just like in 1999, the Liberal Democrat programme will be bold, ambitious, and focus on changing our country for the better. Just like in 1999, we will be ready to win. We're going to be helped in this with our new leader, Vince Cable. Vince Cable has strong links with Scotland. The place that he was first elected was in Glasgow. We are fortunate to have a strong and serious economic thinker at our head. Vince has already set out how he will build a UK-wide programme for the economy that tackles inequality, puts the long-term future of the country first, and puts our young people at its heart. To our new leadership team, Vince Cable and Joe Swinson, I say we are with you all of the way. And our party's unique stance on Brexit meets the Liberal need of change against isolation and divisiveness. This is an exciting time to have the opportunity to lead on Liberal values. And I can announce today that we will open talks with the Scottish Government this week to ask them to back our campaign to give the Scottish people across the UK the chance of an exit from Brexit. And I just want to say to Tim Farron, he always gave us the support, the encouragement, and the campaigning energy. Tim inspired on refugees, on social care, and on Brexit. He recruited more new members than any other leader. He won more MPs, and he built up our party when it needed it most. I will always be grateful for Tim's leadership and his commitment. As Liberals, we believe that power is best exercised when it is shared in the nations, regions and communities. Every Liberal government would rather their ministers were able to get on without things interfering with their work, challenging them, on scrutinising them, on anything else that they do. They want to make their mistakes in private, squander our money without challenge, neglect the difficult issues with impunity. The Conservatives in the Commons this week have contrived to hold on to a majority on the legislative committees. The Conservatives have sought to grip onto powers from Brussels that should be rightly held in Holyrood. The EU withdrawal bill gives powers to ministers to bypass Parliament and avoid awkward questions. Ministers want Henry VIII powers to pursue a disastrous divorce. With a heady mixture of bungling and arrogance, the Conservatives are risking the economic and social well-being of our country. The voters will never forgive the Conservatives for a mindless and incompetent pursuit of a damaging Brexit. We are sick of the sight of the Conservatives sailing HMS Brexit past the Needles Lighthouse out to sea in the search of new colonies. Boris either striding the deck or walking the plank, depending on the day of the week. Philip Hammond discreetly inflating his own life jacket. George Osborne drilling holes in the hull. Theresa May and Michael Gove wrestling at the helm about whether to turn back to port or not. And Jacques Rees-Mogg rowing behind in his family's replica of the Mary Rose. It's much less Christopher Columbus and much more Captain Pugwash. Yet whilst the SNP rightly berate the Conservatives for hoarding power in London, the SNP reciprocated by hoarding power in Edinburgh. The SNP have taken control of powers from councils. They have taken control of the fire service. They have taken control of the police, of social care, of enterprise and economic development. We hear that they want highways too. And now they are planning to take control of education. So that leaves all of the big services out of the democratic hands of local government. So I want to give a warning about what it means when you take all of that together. Councils came together in the 1980s to help form the Constitutional Convention, to challenge the Thatcher government and to draw up plans for devolution. The SNP Scottish Government is on a path to strip out of public life the challenging voice of Scottish local government. Just like the Conservatives, they are opposed to challenge. So that is a threat to the existence of local councils. We will lose local accountability, local services, and the combined clout to challenge government. The SNP are dismantling local government, and Liberal Democrats will stand up to them. The SNP should spend less time demanding and grabbing power and more time delivering on their promises. The powers of the Scottish Parliament are so much greater now. We can do so much more to meet the demands of our time head on. These are the powers we argued for, so we are well placed to make the best use of them. Let's take education. Nursery is the best educational investment we can make, to give many young children the head start they need to overcome the circumstances of their birth. That means that every 2-, 3- and 4-year-old will have access to 30 hours of nursery education every single week. School in Scotland should be the pride of the nation once again, with new investment to reverse the decline of the last decade. College should be once again the vibrant learning environment for skills and training. Confident that we can meet the needs of business and employers. It should be for all ages. It should be where women can pick up their careers again. It should be for lifelong learning. That is why we argued that we raise income tax by 1 penny. 1 penny to raise £500 million for education in Scotland. It is more than just an investment in our education system. It is an investment in the talents of people so that they can be all they can be. It is not a tax rise for its own sake. It is for a tax rise for a purpose. A tax rise that is not an indication of more to come, but a contract with the people to fix a problem and invest in people. An investment that liberates people to be all they can be, but also invest in our economy so that talented people with skills can create economic opportunities, growth and wealth. It's a virtuous circle that benefits not just the students and the pupils, but the wider society too. Investing in the individual, using the new powers that we argued for to make different choices in different parts of the country. Putting power back in the hands of the people. That is the Liberal approach, and that is the approach that we are going to implement. Our 8 years in government in Scotland set out what can be done with the Parliament. And the response to the challenges of today must be a Liberal response. When nationalism threatens with Brexit and Trump, the response must be an open, tolerant and generous one. When climate change threatens with hurricanes and floods, the response must be to protect our planet for tomorrow rather than plunder it for today. When the economic growth of China sometimes threatens people's human rights, our response must be to stand with the oppressed, not surrender for a few jobs. When some companies offer poor working conditions and pay, our response must be to invest in higher standards and better pay. When people struggle to cope with poor mental health, we must be there for them. When people are hungry for knowledge and training, we must invest in their talent through education. When the arrogance of government seeks to hoard power in the centre, we must hand it back to the people. We will build a platform that delivers an open, liberal, environmentally friendly, economically sustainable and fair society, where people have the chance to be all they can be, to live as they wish. It is about the generosity of spirit. It is about sharing. It's a fresh, bright approach to make Scotland the best again. Change is coming in 2021. With policies like this, with ambitions this great, with determination to change, we are winning again. Winning at Holyrood, Westminster and in councils. Liberal Democrats have a big role to play in the future of our country. We made the Scottish Parliament 20 years ago. We forged the first Scottish Government, delivered radical change. We crafted the new powers the Parliament now has. We have the responsibility and the opportunity to craft the new platform for change, moving on from the divisions of independence, moving up for our country. That is the Liberal response to the challenges of today, and we should shout it from the rooftops. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Willie, for just excellent speech. I'd like to thank my aide on the platform, Chris Mains, and my aide in the hall, Victor Chamberlain. I now hand over to Alex Hegenbarth.
Good afternoon, Conference. We will now be debating F28, encouraging companies to be responsible corporate citizens, which can be found on page 38 of the Conference agenda, as well as an amendment to the motion, which can be found on page 6 of Conference Daily. We'll also be taking 1-minute interventions at the intervention stanza on my left or your right. Later on in the debate, there are still plenty of spaces available, so if you'd like to fill in a card, please send it to the speaker's desk. Okay, can I ask Simon McGrath to stand by while I ask Mike Tuffrey to the podium? Thank you.
Good afternoon, Conference, and thank you, Alex. Full marks for being here. It's pouring with rain outside, and we're going to be debating the finer points of corporate governance. So thank you for staying. And this stuff can be a little dry and technical. So let me start by saying why actually it really, really matters. The way our great corporations are run is not a matter just for the current owners. It's not a matter for the senior managers alone. Think of the millions of employees and their families who depend on successful companies for their livelihoods, and think of their local communities who depend on them too, as we see sometimes with devastating consequences when some remote owner orders the closure of a factory in the Midlands or a steelworks in South Wales or a call centre in the Northeast. And it's not just employees. 2/3 of our nation's spending on R&D, that vital innovation on which our future prospects depend, 2/3 comes from companies. That's £20 billion a year, dwarfing what the public sector spends. And public spending, in turn, depends on tax revenues. In fact, companies contribute 30% of all tax revenue, £200 billion a year. That's 2 NHSs come from companies. And if we're to halt runaway climate change, then big companies have to dramatically reduce their emissions. So, whether business is run well or run badly matters to us all. And sadly, business has not been doing a good job, or at least some businesses haven't, because the majority are well run and the majority behave responsibly, but not all and not enough, and now we have a real crisis of trust in business. Vince Cable and Joe Swinson recognised this when they were in government. In the teeth of opposition from the Tories, they made great strides. To give you just one example, Measures that they introduced have doubled the number of women on boards. Yes, doubled. But that's still only 1 in 4, not half. And most are non-executives, not CEOs. And when you look at ethnic diversity, the picture is simply dire. So there is much, much more that we need to do until our great companies are run genuinely in the long-term interest of all who depend on them and who contribute to their success. Hence this motion today, hence the policy working group that I have the privilege to chair with Julia Goldsworthy. Now, you'll be pleased to hear I haven't got time to go through all 12 lines of the motion. Let me set out in the round how we see it working overall. You start with the purpose of the company, including an explicit social purpose in return for the benefits of having limited liability. And it's not simply about the short-term profit of the current owners. You make new forms of corporate constitution possible, particularly, for example, benefit corporations. And you set a higher expectation when our national champions are threatened with takeovers that might damage that. Think Cadbury or Unilever more recently. And when pledges are given during takeovers, they have to be legally binding. Next, you make clear that company directors owe a duty to that wider purpose. Arguably, actually, they do already do so, but we need to drive that home and we need to make them accountable for it. Certainly, we must get more diverse viewpoints into board decision-making. Then you insist that investors vote their shares, that they are responsible owners. You reward those taking a long-term stewardship approach, and this is the thing I particularly like in these ideas, you give individual savers and investors, that's you and me in our pension schemes, a real say over how asset managers vote on the shares, where you and me are ultimately the beneficiaries. Back in the 1960s, more than half of shares were directly owned by individuals. Now it's down to barely 10%. But new digital media allow us to democratize the way unit trusts and pension funds can engage and be accountable for their actions. And then for those shady characters who may be evading tax or laundering the proceeds of crime, you reveal who the beneficial owners of those companies are. Now, pledges have been given to do that, but the current Conservative government has been delaying, and we must support the efforts of Transparency International and others to expose this. Now, what about this really important issue of getting employees' views directly into the boardroom? And we've got an amendment on that to debate in a moment. Conference, be in absolutely no doubt, I want this party to rediscover its historic leadership on this issue. Back in the 20s, Keynes and Lloyd George wrote the Liberal Yellow Book, Britain's Industrial Future. They proposed mandatory works councils at every factory employing more than 50 people. In the 1960s, Joe Grimmond revived the idea of industrial democracy in contrast to Labour's corporatist and union-dominated approach. As a liberal democratic party, it is our unique role, indeed our duty, to champion the rights of people at work and to make the case for a truly participatory approach based on genuine empowerment, not on tokenistic consultation. So why is the Federal Policy Committee asking you not to vote for the amendment? Simply because it offers a prescriptive single solution imposed top-down on every type of company. The motion, on the other hand, strengthened by the drafting amendment, thank you Gordon and colleagues, is rock solid on the principle of employee representation, but flexible about how it is to be achieved. Let's have the debate. Sharon will respond at the end. I pledge that the Policy Working Group will come back with a concrete and workable set of proposals on how to achieve the goals that we all want. So, conference, not dry, dull or boring, I hope. Also, not a bit of tinkering here or a radical change there. What we need is we need a radical approach to this, and it falls to us, the Liberal Democrats,
Thank you very
us
much.
here and now, to provide a liberal, democratic, alternative approach to big business accountability.
Thank you very much. Can I ask Dr. Barbara Gibson to stand by and Simon McGrath to make his way to the podium? Thank you.
Conference, this is a very simple amendment that says one very simple thing, that if you work for a public company or a large private company, you should have the right to have a fellow employee represent you on the board of that company. Why do we propose this amendment? Well, for two reasons. First of all, because we think it's the right thing to do. People often spend much of their lives at work. They depend on the firms they work for their livelihoods, and it's quite right that they should be represented on the boards of those companies. And the second reason, and Mike quite rightly talked about diversity, and the motion talks about diversity, but one of the most diverse sources of input for those boards should be the views of the people that actually work there. I've been to some board meetings in my time, and I can tell you that it's often not the case the directors have anything like the same knowledge of the company and what goes on day to day as the people who actually work in it. Now, what's wrong with the amendment? Well, with the motion, I should say. It's a typical Liberal fudge. It says that we want to promote employee representation. I mean, is there a more vague word than promote? I think this is a very simple thing. We should have employee representatives on boards, and if we believe that, we should pass a motion to say it. Because the trouble with the policy that's in the motion is it's a tick box policy, and there are lots of these in corporate governance at the moment. What happens when companies don't want to do one of these things, they're told they have to consider, is they send someone away, somebody, in this case, probably somebody in human resources, to write a paper. And the paper will say this and that and that and this, and it'll explain why all the things we do at the moment mean we don't have to do the thing that we don't want to do. And I can tell you how I know that's what companies do, because until recently I was one of the people that used to write those papers. And they're fairly easy to write. You just have to, you put a lot of stuff in, and somehow it always comes up with the conclusion that the company chief executive wants to hear. So I want you to reject what's in the motion in favor of the amendment, to be very clear. I don't think there's a huge amount more to say about this. Of course, Mike is completely wrong to say that this doesn't mean that the Working Party, and I was very pleased to hear him saying that the Working Party would take on board some of these points and is going to come back with something. What I want the Working Party to come back with is something that's pretty clear. So let's send them a message that is pretty clear now. We don't pass motions at this conference or these conferences just to have an input into our own working parties. We pass motions at this conference so that we've got a message that we can tell people. And if somebody asks me, and I think it's something we can talk about, what is the Liberal policy on the Lib Dem policy on employee representation, I'd much rather say that our policy is that we think if you work for a company, you have the right to be represented on their board, than blah, blah, we believe in promoting employee representation and formal consultation mechanisms, etc. It's a very simple thing. If you agree with this very simple proposal that employees should have the right to be represented on the board of the firm that they work for, please pass this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask Giles Derrington to stand by and for Dr. Barbara Gibson to make her way to the stage? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Conference, in my experience, which includes 25 years working in the business world in corporate communication, when you show an organization leader the low trust figures of either their organization or their industry, their response is, we have an image problem. And that's usually when my phone rings. My answer in almost every case is, you don't have an image problem, you have a reality problem. And to fix that, you don't need a PR campaign, you need to change behavior and change culture. This motion is a move to shift culture back to British and traditional liberal values of fairness and responsibility. Taking back our culture from other values that have slipped in from where my accent comes from, where it's greed and profit over people. So taking back our culture. To affect culture change, to change people's attitudes, you have to actually very clearly delineate your desired behavior and then reward it. And that's not just about regulations and laws, but it's about public sentiment to influence that change. So we can lead the dialogue here to influence that change and demonstrate our liberal values. I urge you to support this motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask Dr. Brian Matthew to stand by and for Giles Darrington to make his way to the stage?
Conference. Well, as Mike said, this stuff can be a little bit dry at times, so I thought I'd come up and explain to you why you're all incredibly sensible for still being here to listen to people talk about it. It turns out this stuff is really quite important. If you care about people, or you care about business, or you care about the environment, or you care about the economy, making sure that businesses plan for the long term is a fundamental priority. And that's a large part of what this motion does. It seeks to put in place a framework where companies focus as much on the short-term financial in-year benefits as they do on the long-term needs of both the business and everyone who operates and comes into contact with them. To me, the motion is best summed up in lines 45 to 50, changing the Companies Act to rebalance the consideration of the profit motive alongside community and environmental interests. Despite the impression you might get from things like the Sports Direct or BHS scandals, most business leaders actually want to be operating in a more long-term view. But they are concerned, and understandably so, that if they go too far, if they champion a green, worker-friendly company too much, and then that puts things above profit, then they are at risk of being sued by shareholders. It shouldn't be a risk to do the right thing. And that might sometimes mean putting greed above profit. But let's not pretend that profit is a bad thing either. Survey data suggests that only 19% of people think that giving shareholders and investors a return on their investment should be a priority for big business. And that's led to a lot of the anti-business sentiment we've seen since 2008. But it's worth remembering who those investors are, ultimately. When people talk about shareholders, they often think of foreign oligarchs or kind of sinister overseas banks, but for the vast majority of us, we're all shareholders. Particularly if we have pension funds, and so that's why this motion kind of puts pensions and the rights of pension holders into a priority seat. And finally, I just want to kind of close by talking about the kind of fundamental idea of the liberal Democrat values versus some of the other options we could take to understanding corporate interest. We don't have to do the kind of Corbynist approach of ban things. I don't think profit should be a bad word for this party. It is a pro-business, pro-free market party. But if we're to empower leaders, empower shareholders, empower the workers and the communities that support them, then we can build a more modern, dynamic economy that addresses the public good, and that, to me, fundamentally reflects Liberal Democrat values. So, Conference, please support the motion.
Thank you. Can Jenny Lang please stand by? And I ask Dr. Brian Matthew to make his way to the stage.
Friends, there's much about this motion that is appealing. Encouraging sustainability, giving people a stake in the economy, promoting more employee representation on boards, strengthening the law on corporate criminal responsibility. But to restore trust in the behavior of large corporations and their senior management, this is something that has to be earned. And for this to happen, such bodies have to abide by, as is stated in EU law, the precautionary principle. That is, if an action or a policy is suspected of risk of causing harm to the public or to the environment, in the absence of scientific consensus, the burden of proof that it is not harmful falls on those taking action, or the corporations. In the USA, corporations are treated like citizens, which turns the precautionary principle on its head. Innocent until proven guilty. when applied to corporations, means that they can get away with anything unless they are expensively proven guilty. And I say expensively because of the government departments like the Environment Agency and the police being cut. They can do less and less to hold corporations to account. Think fracking and tar sands and other manifestations of corporate greed around the world. Responsibility by all means, yes, but let it be on the basis of the precautionary principle, not on what corporations can get away with. If this motion is approved, then I call on the FPC to see to it that the precautionary principle is embedded in it. Thank you.
Can I ask Jonathan Fortnum to stand by and ask Jenny Lang to make her way to the stage?
Thank you. I should declare an interest. I work in corporate citizenship for a multinational energy company. I spend my day living and breathing responsible business. I spend my day with organisations of all shapes and sizes and types. I can assure you that for the vast majority of organisations, it's not a lack of willingness to be more responsible. Quite often, it's a lack of understanding. Because ultimately, people work in businesses. People are good. People want to do good things. Companies need to understand the benefits, in particular to their bottom line, of being more responsible, and they also need to understand how to do it. Because more often than not, they just don't know how, and that's how we need to share this best practice. I want to pull out 3 examples of companies who are well known for their responsible business. So the first one I'm going to pull out is Google. Google have a vision and ethos built right through their company, which is don't be evil. That sounds pretty good. I have an issue with it. I have an issue because it doesn't say be good. It doesn't empower anyone to change or to innovate or to be better. It just says don't be bad. If we go along the scale a little bit, you get to Kingfisher. So we all recognise they own B&Q, for example. They actually have a really good model that's called net positive. So net positive, essentially everything they do, every touch point they have has to leave the world a better place. Whether that's the people who work for them, their customers, their environment, their supply chain, everything has to be better. That's aspirational. Their people will understand that they have to do more. And then if you go up the scale a little bit further, you get to Unilever, massive global company. All of us will have Unilever products in our house, whether we know it or not. And they have something called the Sustainable Living Plan. And they've set themselves 3 hairy goals. 1, improve health and well-being for 1 billion people by 2020. Halve their environmental impact by 2030. Improve the livelihoods for millions of people by 2020. Massive aspirational goals that that company and all those people can get behind to go out and innovate and empowers them to do more. So this motion's fine. We tinker, we talk about details. It's very much stick, no carrot. But actually, I would say we need to do more. We need to inspire companies to do more, and we need to give them the tools to get there because they want to. But actually, big prescriptive lists of things they have to do are not going to get us there. So I would say reject the amendment. It is far too prescriptive, but support the motion. It's one step along the way. But we as a party can do far more, and we should. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll soon be taking interventions. So if I could ask Sir David William from Twickenham, Nick Sanford from Peterborough, Hugh Brown from Wandsworth, Bridget Gardner from Southwark, and Paul Hindley from Blackpool to stand by, please. I also ask Nick Wakeling to stand by for the stage, and if Jonathan could start.
Good afternoon, conference. This is my first time at conference. I can hardly breathe. I am a partner in a professional services firm and our lead on responsible business. For too long, it seems, corporate success has been measured in terms of short-term economic measures. This quarter's profit, this month's order book, this week's share price. Success has also been won at the expense of the other, wage deals against management, costs driven out by business, reducing headcount. And as with so many areas of society and the economy, this win-lose, attritional view of success is absolutely hopeless for business. The focus has been on positions and power when it needs to be on interests born of collaboration. And those interests are the interests of the stakeholders in a business, those communities on which a business depends for its success, the employees, the customers, the local communities and the global communities. And guess what? Empirical evidence proves that when businesses do take a long-term holistic view of their relationships with their stakeholders, they do better than those who don't. Business in the Community has produced a report that shows that those businesses, some of which the previous speaker identified, when their share price is tracked against the FTSE 100, they outperform. And this is because responsible business is smart business. More engaged, more valued, more diverse employees perform better, both individually and as teams. Engagement and engaged local communities support business when they realize that there are no glass ceilings, when businesses mentor young girls and boys to think beyond and into the future. Businesses benefit when relationships with global regulators are more open and transparent, more trusting and long-term. As I say, responsible business is smart business, and so I support the motion and I do not support the amendment. And that's because I think if we're going to succeed in this absolutely vital objective, then we need to do so in collaboration with business. It's no longer us and them, it's working together in community. And we, as the party of business and of communities, are ideally placed to do this. Yes, we need more carrot, less stick, more reward, less regulation. And we as consumers have the opportunity also to target our buying pound to businesses and products that are responsibly produced, sustainably delivered, and are part of an overall recipe for the benefit of business and the benefit of the stakeholder groups that depend upon it. I support the motion, but not the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. Can Nick Wakeling make his way to the stage, please, after which we'll be having interventions. But after that, can I ask for Ed Long to stand by? Thank you.
Conference. I speak to you as a qualified lawyer and now finance manager with over 20 years' experience working in big companies and startups in the UK and abroad. That doesn't make me some kind of evil capitalist. I absolutely understand what this motion is trying to do. Productivity in this country is lagging. People do feel left behind. The motion is very well intended. But I'm a liberal first and foremost, and I have to say to you that sections 3, 4, and 12 of this motion go far too far. To be clear, these sections propose 3 things. First, they require, note the word require, not promote, large businesses to establish stakeholder advisory panels. Second, they oblige, not promote, directors to consider the long-term interests of all stakeholders, not just shareholders, for the common good, whatever that's supposed to mean. And third, they impose criminal liability for blameworthy corporate failure on individuals without establishing the need for intent or guilt. To repeat those words, oblige, require, abolish the need to establish intent or guilt. These words will wrap our businesses in bureaucratic chains and red tape. 3 reasons why. First, so-called strict liability criminality is limited in this country for very good reason. Take speeding. It doesn't make sense for the Crown Prosecution Service to have to prove intent or guilt every time you bust a camera. But to apply it to as complex a matter as business failure without the ability of an innocent person to defend himself is morally wrong. Second, to force companies to shift their focus in their way will wrap them up in unproductive red tape, it will reduce incentives to hire more than 200 people, and it will give unfair advantage to the bigger players who can afford to pay for that kind of protection. The only people who will benefit from that are consultants. And lastly, it detracts from the real issue here, which is productivity. 2 out of 3 people in this country work in businesses which are low productivity. This does not help with that matter, conference. We need better conditions for investment. We need better adult skills training. We don't need more bureaucracy and red tape. I urge you to reject this motion. It has the best intentions. It will have the worst of unintended consequences. Thank you.
We will now move on to the interventions. So first, can I ask Sir David Williams from Twickenham to start?
Thank you. As the Treasurer of Union of Liberal Students, and I spoke at the Eastbourne Assembly in 1960, I am not a first-time speaker. As this is going to the FPC, it's appropriate for me to suggest an omission which please will you take into account, and there's no reference in this motion to limited liability partnerships. They are subject to gross abuse because of a very opaque and inadequate way that they are controlled, and all you have to do is look back through Private Eye. I've not subscribed to that since it started, but only since 1971. And you will find in that all the evidence you need of the abuse of this. So please, can you take this on board when it goes to the FPC? Thank you.
Thank you. Our next intervention will be from Nick Sanford from Peterborough.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like the previous speaker, I've been coming to these conferences for quite some time. I can remember back in the early 80s, we used to talk a lot about industrial democracy and employee participation, and that seems to slip down the agenda. We need to push it back up to the top. Why should we do that? Because it's a fundamental liberal principle about empowering people. We should empower people, give them a say over Brexit. We should give them a say about running their communities. But they should not cease to have a say when they cross the threshold of a place of employment. They should have a right to a say in how their organisations are run. Now, this motion and the amendment talk about employees on boards of directors. I would reject the amendment because I think it's too prescriptive. I think we should look at a whole plethora of ways of representing employees. And one reason we should do it is that you look at the John Lewis Partnership, one of the most successful companies in the country. They have democracy and participation. We should push for this as hard as we can.
Thank you very much. Our next intervention is from Hugh Brown from Wandsworth.
Conference, I want to speak to the clause 4 of the resolution, which calls for company boards to put under strengthened obligations to take account of the long-term interests of the company and the interests of wider stakeholders, such as those of employees, suppliers and consumers. Very commendable, and I support it, but at the same time, the pressure on companies to prioritise short-term and narrowly financial interests are still very much visible from the enhanced takeover activity currently going on in the stock market. So what I want to suggest is that we need to put a bit of grit into the ease with which one company can take over another in cases where the takeover appears to threaten one of these wider interests promoted by Clause 4. For example, there might be a power for a Monopolies Commission or whatever to delay a takeover where this appeared to be the case.
Thank you very much. Our next intervention will be from Bridget Gardner from Southwark.
There seems to be a surprising omission in this policy motion. The problem of low productivity in the UK is not a mystery, as many claim. It's the result of lack of investment and lack of training. It's the result of relying on low-paid, unskilled workers to make maximum profit for shareholders. I hope the planned policy paper will include firm proposals to require larger companies to invest more in long-term development and less in short-term profit.
Now, And our final intervention will come from Paul Hindley from Blackpool.
Conference. If we are to achieve social justice, we must redistribute not just wealth, but also power. Employees need a voice in their workplace. The time has come to have worker representatives on company boards. Both the Tories and Labour have been happy to fuel the inequality, which has seen the social divide grow over recent decades. The inequality of power within our economy must be challenged. We are the party of cooperatives and we are the party of co-partnership. We Liberal Democrats must be the party to truly bridge the class divide by supporting workers into corporate governance. Support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask Tony Greaves to stand by and for Ed Long to make his way to the stage? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alex, and thank you to Jeff. I'm going to speak in favour particularly of lines 78 to 87, which is on publishing details of corporate beneficial ownership. At last year's autumn conference, I proposed and we passed motion F10 on tackling corruption and corporate crime. At the time, we'd built up significant political momentum on white-collar crime. David Cameron, as Prime Minister, had hosted a global corruption summit, which received a lot of coverage in the press. The Serious Fraud Office was starting to make real headway in prosecutions under the new director, David Green, finally bringing forward really serious cases, such as the Sweet Group case, which was the first ever conviction for failing to prevent bribery. And recently, we've also seen executives from Barclays being the very first criminal charges against senior banking executives related to the financial crisis of 2009. We had also, while in government, launched the first public register of beneficial owners in the world, thanks to work by Vince Cable and some of the colleagues in the Conservative Party, which is a model that's now become widely adopted in other countries as a key tool in corporate transparency. Theresa May was a new Prime Minister at the last conference, and at the time it was really unclear what direction she was going to take, whether she would continue with the progress we had made or whether she would be dropping those in order to fit with our Brexit negotiations. So what has the government done since then? In January this year, Philip Hammond tried to threaten the European Union with adopting a hard Brexit tax haven regulatory framework, if necessary, to maintain our economic competitiveness. He received backing from the Prime Minister for taking that stance. After being informed that doing so would block any future trade deal with the EU, and perhaps gaining a degree of humility after their poor result in the snap general election, he seems to have gone back on that and backed down on that particular approach, although I noticed that Boris Johnson's pitch for Prime Minister over the weekend seems to be looking back at following that particular model. Theresa May has also taken aim at the Serious Fraud Office. The Conservative manifesto this year threatened to abolish it and roll it into the National Crime Agency, which would be under more direct government control. And it's notable that several of the live cases being pursued by the Serious Fraud Office were significant donors to the Conservatives' election campaign. How does this affect society? In the wake of the Grenfell Tower fire, investigations into ownership of empty properties in Kensington and Chelsea revealed 1,399 empty properties, a significant number of which were owned by opaque and uncontactable offshore firms. It's a clear example of how a lack of transparency fuels a lack of responsibility for the communities in which people are owning property. We live in a political environment where large sectors of our society are economically and politically excluded and are looking for people to blame for their suffering. In so many of these cases, injustices faced by citizens cannot be remedied due to dead ends reached in tracing ownership and responsibility. Let's not give up our place as a leader in the world on tackling corporate corruption and abandon the real progress made in Europe on demanding better corporate governance. Please support the motion. I would say reject the amendment, but please support this motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. So may Ashley Cartman please stand by, and I ask Tony Greaves to make his way to the stage. Thank you.
Chair, fellow Liberals, 52 years ago, when I was also a first-time speaker, that's what we called people, and at the Liberal Party Assembly in 1965, I made my first speech on a motion to that Assembly about what in those days we called co-partnership. That was the involvement of representatives of employees in the in the boards and in the management of companies. Very different world in those days. Most companies in this country were controlled by British control, by British owners, and most employees got a job and probably had a job with that same employer, if not exactly the same job, for the rest of their life. In the last half century, since I made my maiden speech, the world has changed hugely. And this party, as one of the previous speakers said, has largely forgotten about co-partnership and those policies. So I am delighted that they have reappeared in this motion today, although I have to say in a fairly watered-down, feeble form compared with the radical policies of the Liberal Party 50 years ago. I just want to put forward 3 or 4 reasons for caution, though, and I'll just really state what they are because I haven't time to explain them too much, but they're all fairly obvious. The first is the changing nature of employment and the changing world of work. And the previous motion this afternoon, which I think was an excellent motion on employment in the 21st century, I think sets us in this party on a path of thinking about those issues, but we need to also think about the implications of the kind of gig economy employment that we now have for co-partnership policies, and indeed, what is the future of employment itself? And again, the whole question of automation, as we used to call it, and robotics was being raised. The second is the increasing dominance of multinational business, global corporations, particularly but not only in the world of IT, artificial intelligence, companies like Google, Amazon, Facebook and Apple and all the rest. How does it apply to them? And in particular, to the huge question of the control of data. Third question I'd like the group to look at is the question of public sector employment and how employee participation within the public sector can be introduced, because clearly it has to be different, but the principles are the same. And finally, the role of trade unions. And I spoke about that 52 years ago as well, and I don't think we've made much progress in this party. But the Labour Party can't do it because of their relationship with the unions. But I believe that this party, working with sensible people in trade unions, can work out a future sensible and progressive role for trade unions in the future. The fundamental principles of this motion are fundamental to liberalism and fundamental to this party, but it's going to be a heck of a job working it out. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask Paul Burrell to stand by, please, and ask Ashley Cartman to the stage? Thank you.
Hello, conference. I went to a Fringe event 2 hours ago when I was inspired by Paddy Ashdown. It doesn't seem such a good idea as a first-time speaker. Now I'm stuck here, so bear with me, please. This is not a bad motion, I think. I've worked in companies from the largest listed FTSE 100s to the smallest, helping them with their corporate governance. And there are good things and there are not so good things about this motion. I think the bit I object to is the latter part in terms of the lines 88 and 89, when really what we'll be doing when we vote for this is calling on the 21st Century Economy Working Group to further develop these ideas. When I read that, I was concerned because when I first got involved with the Liberal Democrats, it's because when I looked at the economy, I got angry. I got angry with the rising inequality, the corporations not paying their tax, job insecurity. I worry about the challenges from AI and automation that are coming. And it seems to me by focusing on this, we're in danger of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Is this really what we want our working party to be thinking about? Are there not more important things that we should be doing? I think the answer to that is yes. With Theresa May careering down nationalism, protectionism, and frankly, economic vandalism, we should be focusing on the big questions of what the 21st century economy should be, not about how companies should be governing themselves, although that may be important. There are bigger fish to fry. You know, our economy faces loads of challenges: financial, fiscal, distributional, ecological, and frankly, existential. The Church of England even are calling our system as broken, and yet we are debating corporate governance. You know, as a first-time member, it saddens me to really stand up here and ask you to vote against a motion. But when I thought about when I go home and I talk to my children and they say, "Dad, what did you do at the conference? How did you help make this country a better place, a fairer place, and a society where we all share in the profits of everything and the wealth that we've got?" Do I want to say, A, I voted for better corporate governance? Or do I want to say, B, I looked at it and I said it wasn't good enough. I told my party to be more radical, and I told them to go away and think again. And I hope that you think about what you'll say to your children, to your grandchildren, and your friends when you go home. Which one do you want to say? I know what I want to say, and I urge you to do the same. Thank you.
Can I ask Gordon Lishman to stand by and for Paul Burrell to make his way to the stage? Thank you.
I want to change the focus briefly onto the relationship between local companies and their local communities. And I want to give two examples, one special and one more generic. I'm active in a very large local civic society, which has, among other things, 40 corporate members. Frankly, they join as a tick box, and they can put it on the website and feel friendly. Last year, because a lot of the companies in Norwich, where I come from, have difficulty recruiting experienced, skilled staff from elsewhere, we actually commissioned some research into why that was. One of the reasons was a perception that Norwich was not a particularly nice place to live. We're now working with those companies to try and A, correct the perception, and also make sure that Norwich continues to be a good place to live and work. More generally, there's a lot of evidence that access to green spaces, parks, woodland, trees and so on, actually helps productivity. It's been published in The Lancet, and there are a number of reasons for this. One is it makes people feel good, but more importantly, it actually cuts quite significantly the amount of illness, physical, both mental, people suffer from and therefore take time off. And therefore, companies that can contribute to helping to keep their local green spaces in good condition by perhaps giving them some grants to some local organisations to help look after them, or even allowing paying paid time for some of their staff to go and work to help to keep those green spaces good, pays back. It helps the local community, it helps the company, and that, frankly, is true of a whole lot of this, what we talk about, the corporate responsibility. It isn't just for the benefit of people other than the company, it benefits the company as well. And I think we need to remember that, because it justifies what we're proposing, it helps to get support for it, and it's important at the local level as well as the sort of national level and international level we've been talking about, which is obviously very important indeed. Support the motion.
Thank you. Can I ask Joe Otten to stand by and for Gordon Lishman to make his way to the stage? Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, and good afternoon, conference. I want to make sure that you understand just how important the amendment that has already been accepted and written into this motion is. It actually delivers exactly what Simon McGrath talked about in his speech. It says that we want worker representation by law. That's the crucial thing about adding in the word legislation. So what we are saying here is that we're committing ourselves as a party to the principle of worker representation. When Mike moved this motion, he talked about Lloyd George and Keynes and Grimond. In fact, of course, it was John Stuart Mill's Principles of Political Economy, which was the foundation of our thinking as a party, and in those days, a very new, even predecessor party. But thank you for mentioning Joe Grimond, not least because I was the person who actually wrote the policy that Mike was talking about. And that policy, agreed by the whole of the party, was for annual representative meetings, replacing AGMs of companies, at which employees would have 50% of the vote. And that's why I don't want you to accept the amendment here, because of the appalling timidity of the phrase "at least one," and because it seems to believe that 200 rather than 150 or 500 or anything else is the only touchstone that can be built into this motion. But the best of both worlds, the policy I wrote in 1969 was very good, but like a lot of other things that I've done in this party, it's now history. What I want to look at from this motion, and I want the policy committee to take forward, and I want the working party to take forward, is for the future. And that is to say, as a party, how in a globalized world we bring the principles of worker representation into reality. I was emboldened in taking a view of this by the fact that when Vince was talking with Francis O'Grady of the TUC in the SLF meeting at our last conference, Francis asked the question, "Are you in favour of workers on boards?" And Vince said, "Yes, of course." And that led us on to the question this year of, well, what exactly are you going to do about it? And our amendment, accepted and written in to this motion, is to say, we insist that that representation will be by law, that workers will have the right, and that we will work out how to do that, not just on the at least one representative basis on which Simon was actually very nearly upstaged by Theresa May, but about how we build the representation of employees firmly, thoroughly, directly into the governance of all of our corporate bodies in the United Kingdom. And in agreeing this motion, you agree that amendment and you agree the crucial underlying principle of legislation in order to establish that representation.
Thank you. Can I ask Sharon Bowles to stand by and for Joe Otten to submit the amendment?
Thank you, Conference. I think we've had quite a good debate here. I'm very pleased that a number of speakers have stood up and come to the intervention microphones and spoken about the importance of worker representation on boards. I have written a speech on reiterating the values of that it's the right thing to do, that the power over your lives should not stop, as one of the intervention speakers said at the factory door, that it promotes diversity on the board and therefore better decisions on the board. But I hardly need to go into that because I think everybody agrees. We all seem to agree on that. And so it is a puzzle that how speaker after speaker have said, let's have worker representation on boards, but as an afterthought, without giving any reasons, but vote against the amendment. Mike Tuffrey began talking about our historic leadership on this issue and referred to Joe Grimond, of course. There's more recent historic leadership on the issue. Our election manifesto in 2017 here says on page 43, the right for employees of a listed company to be represented on the board. It was disappointing to see when this motion was printed that the right for companies to be represented on the board was changed to promoting worker representation on boards. We now have a drafted-in amendment which takes that fudge and fudges it slightly differently. It still begins with the word promote, whereas our amendment begins with the word require. That's the difference between a weak policy and a strong one, between a clear policy and a fudge. I do urge you, Conference, to choose the strong and clear policy and not the weak fudge. Jenny Lang spoke to this paper, said, it's fine tinkering with corporate governance, but we need to do more. Let's do more. Let's do something specific. Let's require worker representation on boards. Jonathan Portland said from the intervention microphones, it's no longer us and them. It's no longer us and them. We put workers on the boards. Nick Sanford said it's a fundamental liberal principle that people have power over their own lives, and that is right. And those lives include the life at work. Paul Hindley spoke of bridging the class divide in the boardroom. Ed Long spoke of Theresa May's flirtation with this policy. Well, let's not be outdone by Theresa May. Let's not say we're still thinking about it. Let's not take away from this conference a commitment by the working group to think about it some more. We had the policy on our election manifesto this year. Let's have the policy today as well by voting for the amendment and not for the fudge. Ashley Cortman spoke about further development and was afraid we were arranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Well, if we don't pass the amendment, we're not talking further development, we are undeveloping. We have a policy already, and we are talking about losing it by not passing this amendment. And Gordon Lishman, I think, I'm very sorry to say, but the amendment that was drafted in is not the same. It's not the same as the amendment that has been proposed. The Federal Conference Committee, which chooses the amendments, did not take two amendments that do the same thing and draft one of them in and put the other one up for debate. That would be a pointless thing to do. You know, if they're the same, then draft one of them in or choose one for debate and reject the other one. They didn't do that because our amendment is to require, as it says in text, require worker representation on boards, and theirs is not. Now, I congratulate the working group on the work they've done. There is may not be aware if you're new to conference, there's a process that goes on here, and the working group do a lot of work, and they will send a number of speakers into the debate, and they will have a line, and they have clearly decided they don't want our amendment for whatever reason we still haven't heard. And so that is why a number of speakers will have come here and said, well, we support workers' representation on boards, but please vote against the amendment anyway, for no reason given. Please, conference, don't accept that. Send them the message that this is the policy-making form of the party, not the working group, good as they are. Assert your rights as members of the party, protect the policy we just fought the election on, and vote for the amendment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I ask Sharon Bowles to make her way to the stage to summate the motion as a whole?
Thank you, Chair. Conference, and thank you for all of the people who have spoken to make this a very good debate. The principles that run throughout this motion are transparency, accountability, and diversity in our corporate world. In particular, I say diversity, and it's not just of people, but also of types of companies, and taking account of the new type of employment discussed in the previous motion this afternoon, which a couple of speakers have already mentioned. Now, not everything is nailed down. We have to leave something for the working group to do. And actually, the working group doesn't only do this, it does a lot more besides, including the employment resolution and other things. But what is at the heart of this motion is culture, as Barbara said, and in fact, as Giles said, stakeholders and how to do it. Let's look at it a little closer. Paragraphs 1, 2 and 3 are about who is round the board table, how to make sure that there is wider vision. As Jenny said, how to make sure they know how to do it. Paragraph 4 is about how to get the vision of a board where it should be. And if you don't want to take a common good, do no harm requirement, I want to know why not. Paragraph 5 and 6 are more options on inclusive business structures and long-term perspectives. Paragraphs 7 and 8 are ways to improve stewardship and to ensure end beneficial owners can have their say. Paragraph 9 covers more governance for private companies. Paragraph 10 looks at public interest in takeovers, and we can take on board the grit that's needed, mentioned by Hugh. Paragraph 11, transparency of beneficial ownership of offshore companies and UK properties, issues well covered by Ed. Paragraph 12 is important. It's making sure that large companies, that's companies, not individuals, don't escape criminal prosecution simply because the companies are large and complex. This is about failure to prevent type offences like we already have for bribery and tax evasion, where you don't have to find a director guilty first as the directing mind. If the company hasn't got processes in place, the company is guilty. The individual is dealt with separately. Now, we've had a debate on employees on boards, and Simon and Joe, my heart is with you entirely. Paragraph 2, though, is no soft option, though I admit the drafting has been improved and could have been improved further. But it means serious representation. The other formal mechanisms isn't a cop-out. That means something with real power. And it's there to cope with different types of company structures. For example, employee-owned companies, where employees certainly have a voice, they don't always appear to be on the board. Sometimes they are in the trust company, and they can have vetoes, so there are other arrangements. But our wish for a more diverse corporate structure has meant that the Federal Policy Committee has said, well, don't close this off entirely into one model. We want the flexibility for the future. I fear that the financial crisis showed us, and Grenfell too may show us, that it's difficult to find companies guilty to a criminal standard. And we have to address this, and therefore paragraph 12 is very serious, and I ask you to support it. It will improve matters greatly, and it relates to a problem already identified by the Law Commission, the OECD, and the Serious Fraud Office. It's why there are no libel prosecutions, criminal prosecutions of companies. It's why there was no criminal prosecution of a company in phone hacking. You can't find the guilty individual. Public confidence in large corporations and corporate culture is at a low ebb. The requirements in this motion are not, in fact, onerous. They are decent behaviour. Good governance doesn't make you uncompetitive. And if a company is shy of doing these things, I want to know why. Please support the motion, and please leave it as it is with the advice of the Federal Policy Committee without the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you to everybody who took part in the debate today. We will now be taking a vote on whether to accept the amendment. So can I see all those in favour, please? Please lift your voting cards up high. Thank you. And those against? Can I see that again, please? So all those in favour? All those against? Okay, that's clearly carried. Thank you. We'll now take a vote on the motion with the amendment. So, as it stands, so all those in favour? And all those against? That's clearly carried. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank my aides, Jeff Payne and James Gerling, and I'll pass the chair on to Jenny Lang.
Good afternoon, conference. And we are now moving into our feedback session on the manifesto from the last election. This is very much about you. This is about you telling us what you thought about the manifesto, what were the good bits, which bits didn't work quite so well. I'm joined by a very illustrious panel this afternoon. So I have Dick Newby, who was the chair of the manifesto group. I have Duncan Brack and Sarah Ludford, who are both vice chairs of FPC, and James Girling, who was chair of the Federal Campaigns and Elections team. So you can put your questions to them, you can put your thoughts to them, but as I say, this is very much about you. I'm just going to hand over now to Duncan and to James. They're going to set the scene about discussion and the topics that we're going to cover today.
Thanks very much, Jenny, and welcome to all of you. Now, as Jenny said, the purposes of this session, we're having it because, of course, normally FPC would undertake a long period of consultation in drawing up our election manifesto in the run-up to the election. Of course, we didn't have any time to do any of that. So we want to hear your views on what we did, and we can learn from that for next time, particularly, of course, if we have another snap election, which is not impossible. So the purpose of the session is to let you tell us what you thought of our 2017 manifesto. Were its main messages the right ones, or should they have been different? What particular policies worked well in your area, or what worked badly? What issues were often raised by voters, which were not covered adequately or at all in the manifesto? Did we get our proposals for additional taxation and public spending and the balance between them right, and so on? We're going to split the session into 5 sections, and Jenny will take you through all of them. So we'll start with the main messages and the chapter on Europe, which was obviously a core theme of the manifesto. Then we'll go on to health and education and families and communities, then economy and environment, then rights, justice, equalities, international, political and constitutional reform, and then the manifesto costings and our kind of fiscal stance. So Jenny will remind you what we're dealing with and the key messages in the manifesto, and then we want you to respond under those sections. Just a bit of background on the process and how we did it this time. Under the party's constitution, the FPC, of course, has the duty to produce the manifesto. And we produce it from the policy that is approved by you. Policy papers and policy motions that are debated and voted on by conference. In this, we are far and away the most democratic of the major parties. Now, of course, FPC doesn't put all of the policy of the party in the manifesto. It would be hundreds of pages long. So it's our duty to choose which policy proposals to include, and we effectively set priorities. What are the important things we want to get over to the electorate? And where existing policy has become obviously out of date, we may need to do some work in updating it in line with its original aims. The normal process which we would follow in doing this, and people who've been around for a few years will remember the run-up to 2010 and 2015 and so on, we would set up a manifesto group to do the hard work for us, probably about 2 years out from the election. We would consult widely within the party. We'd produce a pre-manifesto document for debate at the autumn conference before the election, setting out the main themes and the main messages, so no one's springing any surprises on the party. And we might even do a shorter paper the autumn conference before that. So there's a long run-up to the election. And then we'd write the manifesto itself as a development of those preliminary papers over about the 9 months leading up to the election. This, of course, assumes we know when the election is going to happen. So what happened this year was not like that at all. Happily, we had done a lot of work, and I pay tribute in particular to Dick Newby, who chaired the group who did the work, last year in 2016, because we thought there might be a possibility of Theresa May calling a snap election after she became Prime Minister in the summer. So we did have a draft that wasn't quite finalised, but we had done a lot of work on it. So that was enormously helpful in this year when the election was called on 18th April. We used that draft that we written at the end of last year as the basis for a consultation to the extent that we could with FPC members, with parliamentary spokespeople in the Commons and the Lords, with chairs of our policy working groups, with party SAOs and AOs and so on. We did what we could. Over the next 11 days, we went through 4 successive drafts of the paper, of the manifesto. The FPC met in an emergency meeting on the 2nd of May to amend and approve the draft, and we went to print on the 8th of May. So basically, we did what we normally do in 9 months in 3 weeks. And then the manifesto was launched on the 17th of May. And alongside all that, thank you, you're quite right. Alongside all that, costings figures were produced and approved by the FPC and published online. And of course, the manifesto itself and the costings figures are all available online. As somebody was indicating, this was quite an achievement. Now, most of the credit must go to Dick and his group who produced the 2016 version, and of course the incredibly hard-working policy staff in HQ who did most of the writing, our policy advisor staffs, and particularly our policy unit staff, Rachel Kark and Christian Moon. I want to put on record my thanks to them. James's committee, James Girling's committee, the Federal Campaigns and Elections Committee, and the campaign staff of the party obviously fed into the manifesto in terms of priorities more than detailed policies. Obviously, the main theme was Brexit, that kind of worked for itself, followed by health, then education, then economy, and then everything else, pretty much. You can see the order of the chapters in the manifesto for the way in which we prioritise the issues. Now, the FPC's responsibility ended there with the production of the manifesto. What happened afterwards is up to James and his committee and the campaign staff and what happened throughout the campaign. In terms of the process, it went, I think, pretty well as we could have expected given the short period. But of course, the important thing is whether the manifesto was of use to us in the election. By and large, we think we did a reasonably good job. It was by and large well received in the party. The costing stood up well. You might remember that the Institute for Fiscal Studies analysis of the three main parties' manifestos concluded that ours was the most redistributive, the fairest, and of the three, and an Oxford economics analysis also concluded that our plans would be better for economic growth than the other two. So that's quite of some value. And it's also worth noting, despite the fact we had no warning at all of the election, we did manage to conduct a democratic process, unlike the Tories, where even though they did know about the election in advance, many of their cabinet ministers only found out what was in their own manifesto when it was published. And of course, we did at least manage to avoid a car crash like the dementia tax. But despite all that, obviously the election was a disappointment. We lost votes overall, even while gaining seats. So either the manifesto was not as good as we thought it was, or it was a good manifesto, but it wasn't used in the right way, or perhaps it was good in detail, but it lacked a compelling overall message, or maybe actually manifestos don't actually count for all that much in election campaigns, particularly for third parties like ourselves which struggle for press coverage. Or maybe it was all those reasons. This is your chance to tell us what you think and tell us what you think we should do differently next time. And I look forward to hearing your views. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan. No? Duncan said it all. James doesn't need to say anything more. So we're going to move into the main sessions now. So this is literally show of hands. If you have something desperately you want to say, I'm going to come to you. I have 4 fabulous stewards in the hall who have roving microphones. We're going to start off, we're going to go through section by section. We're going to start off around the main messages and the manifesto introduction, in particular Europe. So just as a quick reminder, there are some copies of the manifesto going around the hall if you haven't lovingly brought yours with you. And you can also get them online. So some of the headlines from this section were that the country should decide on a final deal through a referendum, including the option of remaining in the EU, and that Liberal Democrats will campaign for the UK to remain in the EU. So these were kind of the key themes from this particular section. So hands up who would like to kick things off. I've got a gentleman here with a beard, and then a gentleman right at the back with a check shirt. I'm going to start moving this around the hall, so don't worry, I will try and catch your eye and come to you.
Thank you. Alan Fox, Leicester. Love the front cover. Change Britain's future. Then we get to this page. Your chance to change Britain's future by changing the opposition. Destroys it entirely, doesn't it? I think that, I think the majority of this manifesto is brilliant. It's really good. All these policies, they're great. But by denying that there was any other outcome than a Conservative majority government, by refusing to accept that we might have a place in government, and thereby, I think, denying all the good work we did in the 5 years that we were in government. I think that the moment that we put out our stall, our poll ratings went down from about 11% to about 7%, and they stayed there throughout the campaign. And as an agent who lost 3 deposits, I'm sure I might have saved 1 or 2 or 3 of them if we hadn't made that fatal error.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the gentleman at the back with the check shirt. Yeah.
You can hear me. Oh, there we go. That's better.
Can I just say, could you actually just say who you are and where you're from? That'd be really useful as well.
So my name's Raj Chowdhury. I'm from Sheffield Hallam. I think my feeling about the manifesto, and this is about the general message and how it was conveyed. I think you mentioned, sorry, I've forgotten your name, the gentleman who spoke a second ago. You talked about the fact that that various bodies, the IFS, had mentioned that we were not only the best from the point of redistribution, but also from the point of view of economic growth. I often think as Liberal Democrats, we're scared to talk about money because we're worried that we're going to end up halfway between the Labour Party on the left with their redistribution and the Tories on the right with their cuts and economic growth. Actually, I think as a party, we can claim both those mantles, and I don't think we do that obviously enough. What I think for the next manifesto, whenever the next election is, whether it's in 2 months or 5 years, that is something that we can do, that we can say, actually, we do all of this stuff better than the other parties, but more than that, if you want economic growth, you need an effective welfare state, and if you want an effective welfare state, you need an effective economy, and neither of the parties can offer those, and that's why their offerings are weak.
Okay, thank you. We are trying to keep these roughly in this order. We will come on to other subject areas we go through. Okay, there's a lady in a sort of pattern jacket and orange t-shirt over there. I'm going to come over to this wing. There's a gentleman with red hair down here. Right, we start over here.
Okay, it's Lindsay Goff from South Gloucestershire. Now, I'm only joined the party in December. I have spoken before in this thing, so there's no need to clap. My point here is, I think this is a great document, but it's 100 pages long. And I'm not sure who the panel expects to read it, beyond journalists, some of the august bodies that you've met, and so on. And so my big concern is that although it might contain an awful lot of good messaging, if it's not read, then it's wasted. And my recommendation would be that when we do this another time, we have a management summary, a flyer or something that talks more general, in more general terms that can be shared in this world of instant messaging and short attention spans, and that people can readily understand. And then if they want to find out more, they can look at the big document.
Yes, just start talking.
Yeah, on the issue of Europe, yes, we are the party of Remain. I think, unfortunately, this has got overemphasised in the election. I don't know whether that's our fault or that's just the media. But in areas like the southwest, where I come from, the East Devon, it's a leave area. It just turns people off, and the broad mass of people, whether remain or leave, they just get bored of the issue, and it's not one of people's top priorities. So we need to talk, especially in these areas where we need to win. In the southwest, where you used to be very strong, we need to talk about other things like housing, transport, the economy. Just accept the referendum result and move on.
Thank you. Sorry, what was your name, sir?
Andrew Toy from East Devon.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to go up to the galleries. There's a lady there with a kind of orangey t-shirt. And to go over to this side, there's a gentleman right up the back and behind the wall with a kind of checked shirt.
Christine Headley from Stroud, where we lost our deposit for the second time. I did the artwork for the election address, which I think is what the lady from South Gloucestershire would regard as the public face of the manifesto. I found the artwork we were given, I did all the dropping in of artwork for the election address, very, very Eeyore and negative about both Labour and Conservatives, I could have done something with something sort of Tiggerish and orange.
Tigger, write that down. More Tigger, please. Gentleman up here.
Ollie Glover from Wandsworth. Three general comments about the manifesto and our message. The first one, just want to agree with my colleague down there at the front. The manifesto is brilliantly detailed, fantastic on policy, but incredibly long. And I just wonder if, not being an expert on these things, is it best to have something that's very long and very detailed, or is it actually better to have something that's perhaps 10 pages and more focused on the messages and the key themes with other documents given the full underpinning detail? Not sure. My second point is one of the things that we all know continues to come up on the campaign trail is about the legacy of our time in government. The manifesto doesn't say anything very much about it, particularly from the introductory spiel. Maybe the manifesto isn't the place for that, but what is our strategy? Is it just to hope that as years gone by, people stop having a go at us for it, or can we create sort of a proud and compelling narrative about what we contributed in government and what we learned from it? And my third point, which may be a little bit controversial, to address Duncan's point about the lack of media coverage of some of our brilliant policies, I fear that that's partly because the bulk of the media coverage we got during the election campaign was about our leaders' views on homosexual sex. Hopefully that can be avoided in future.
Thank you. I'm going to take just a couple more comments, particularly around the introduction and Europe, and then we're going to move on to some other sections. So there's a gentleman here, kind of at the front with a sort of hoodie on, and a lady in a kind of leopard print jacket over here.
Hi, I'm David Mitchell from Enfield Party. I'm just wondering, a lot of people are talking about the length of the manifesto and also how we struggle to get take control of the media coverage during these campaigns. Would it be possible? Would it be an interesting idea to maybe do a staggered release of a manifesto, so that each week we're releasing folks on a different policy, keeps us setting our own agenda in the media week by week, and it also breaks these things down into quite clear, concise points as a novel way to release a manifesto?
Thank you very much. The lady over here with the
Jane Dodds from Montgomeryshire in Wales. I'd firstly like to pay tribute to you as a group for all of the work that you did and also for holding this session. I mean, it is a real opportunity for us to show democracy in action. But I suppose my perspective is that it's a very, very difficult job to span so many topics. My view is we need one or two very, very clear messages to campaign on. People didn't know what we stood for. Nothing landed with people. And we just need one or two things that we just keep going at time and time and time again. And people will then see what we're standing for. So there's lots of ideas around the social justice agenda, around penny on income tax for health that we kind of missed. Those should be the only things we campaign on, and then the rest of it should be the detail around the broad range of topics. But thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Right, I'm going to come back to the panel, just based on the points that we've had from the floor so far. Are there any specific things you want to pick up on at this stage?
Yes, I'll kick off on the contrast, shall we say, from the introduction, as was pointed out, I think, by Alan, the first comment on this. This, of course, is one of those examples of reflecting the position as was in a document that was actually went through a print and publication process that took us out into a different time frame. So it's pretty clear that at the beginning of this campaign, there wasn't a poll, there wasn't a commentator that didn't think that Theresa May was going to storm ahead, and that was, the outcome was, a given. And that's the context in which this was written. And there is a tactical question, you're quite right, about whether or not it's sensible to put a realistic tactical message at the beginning of what is a programme for government, which says we're not going to be government. And the logic of the article of the forward there was basically, let's face reality. We are where we are. We were nearly wiped out in 2015. Was it credible for us to claim that we were going to be the next government? Now, that's a tactical claim that perhaps everybody was thinking quietly, it may be, but not something that actually feels right in a programme for government document that this manifesto is. And I think that's a fair comment, and I think that's something that we have to take on board when we're doing future introductions, when we look at documents like this. But it is also the case, and I think there is a lot of people have assumed that this document, you know, I mean, I'm sure you've all read it in great detail and have read it to your children at bedtime, because it's a very good way to get them to go to sleep. But there is a lot of campaignable stuff in this manifesto, and that was clear at the very beginning. There was actually a smaller version. I think that was mailed out. That was mailed out to everybody to put some of these things in context, and hopefully, by the sounds of it, not everybody, but people will have used that as a guide to the manifesto. But in the time that we had, and Duncan talked very eloquently about how we had to truncate that process, actually the process to turn that considerable document into a communicable format that entails is in itself quite an achievement. So in this instance, for a snap election, I think we did what we could. I think it's interesting that there's some feedback that people want a more, if you like, newsy version. And we have in the past done manifestos that have been slightly more, if you like, accessible in format. But the truth is, journalists are going to come back to us for the detail that sits behind even that newsy format. And one thing that we have established as a party is a rigour in the way in which we do both our policy and in which we cost it that is unmatched. And we did see what the trouble that the Conservatives got it themselves into when they had some great random ideas, but they hadn't put any costing behind it. And worse than that, they hadn't got the political buy-in of their members, let alone their cabinet. So this is a considerable achievement that we have, and these are well-made points, and I'm sure we can learn from that experience the next time we go through this.
Dick.
Thanks very much. Because I was involved in putting the manifesto together, I had to do, or I ended up doing quite a lot of media around it. So the question of length and priorities and messaging was very much borne in on me. I think we've got to distinguish a document of some length, whatever that length is, and the messages. The truth is, virtually nobody had a single clear, positive message in their minds on polling day, and that wasn't because this was too long. It was because we failed, for whatever reason, to get very clear, small number of messages across. What, though, you do have to do in a general election, you have got to be able to explain from day to day what your policy is on more than the one or two things. So we had to have a credible, hopefully compelling message on the NHS. We had to do the same with education. We had to do, obviously, the same with Europe, and on a raft of things, because me or other spokespeople had to go and explain to audiences beyond, as it were, the 9 o'clock news, what our policy was in a specific area. And given that the corpus of Lib Dem policy is several feet deep, there needs to be a distillation, first of all of us could easily use, and we knew what our priorities were within this body of policy that had been drawn up over a number of years. But also, lots of people look at you as a party and say, okay, what's your housing policy? And the manifesto provides a vehicle for you to say, well, go and look at the manifesto, and then if you've got detailed stuff. So separate out the message from the substance and be good at the message would be my first sort of learning from this. Whether this is the right length, I don't know. It's shorter than certainly shorter than the other parties' manifesto. It's quite a bit shorter than the Labour manifesto. It's significantly longer than the manifesto on which Attlee fought the 1945 general election. But politics has sort of moved on from there. So I think it may not be quite the right length. I do think there are far too many at the bottom end of the chapter, very little things. But the process is, as you do it, we're very democratic. We spent 8-10 hours finalising it, and everybody has their own hobby horse, which they are very, very keen as the body, the committee, weakens and gets tired, they say, if you only put this paragraph in, or this sentence, this phrase about fishing, or whatever it is, and it's as if, you know, you are on a diet, and everybody says, well, if I only have that little biscuit, it won't matter. And you do end up with something rather larger than you expected. But I do think you've got to start with a relatively substantive document to prove that you're serious across the whole policy front.
Thank you. I have to say the manifesto was core reading. I think we're only going to take a couple of comments after each section, simply for... Oh, sorry.
Europe, so.
Oh, right, okay, yeah, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I'm thinking about Dick's last comment and how I only had a small amount of that ice cream at dinner last night. I just want to talk about the Europe part. I mean, I think we did. Someone said there was an overemphasis on us as the party of Remain, and we weren't talking to Leave voters, and that we should accept the referendum result and move on. Well, I think that isn't the majority view in the party, and you know, everyone expected the election to be mainly about Brexit, and it is the big issue in town, as it were. I mean, this is the biggest thing we have to grapple with, and nothing else will go right if we don't properly sort the question of Brexit. And, you know, there is lots of other stuff in the manifesto on public services, environment, and so on. So we didn't just talk about Europe, but we will have to try and as a lot has been saying, a lot has been said at this conference, talk to Leave voters through the prism of respect for their vote, but understanding how we can perhaps ask them to have another look at whether Brexit is going to be good for them and whether it fulfills the reasons why they voted Leave in the first place, which were obviously rather disparate. So we certainly aren't ignoring Leave voters, but you know, Brexit is the big elephant in the room, and that has to be the biggest priority for us. And just on that, you know, question of long document, short document, Duncan has reminded me, I found this at home and I couldn't remember how I got it, but apparently every member did get mailed this document, and presumably we could have acquired more copies. And, you know, the manifesto detail is necessary mainly because NGOs will go through it and journalists get their stuff. Journalists will never read it because they're lazy, but they then depend on the NGOs to mediate that information. So it is essential to have that stuff, as well as for spokespeople and PPCs and so on. But this document would do for people who wanted a little bit more, and then it is up to campaigners, whether the artwork was right, was above my pay grade, but to try and translate that into focus leaflets with a few headline points.
Brilliant, thank you very much. We're going to shift on now onto the chapters around health, education, families and communities. So just a quick reminder, this included the penny and the pound on income tax for the NHS and social care services. This was investing nearly 7 billion extra in children's education, and also extending free childcare to all 2-year-olds. So if we could keep the comments around these areas, that'd be absolutely fantastic. So I've got a gentleman here with a kind of jacket and white shirt, and a lady there with mid-length blonde hair.
Hello, my name is Jeremy Hilton. I was the parliamentary candidate for Gloucester, and I thought the 1p up for the NHS was a good idea, but as a parliamentary candidate, it made it very difficult to argue that we'd been increasing the income tax thresholds. My Conservative opponent was taking claim for that when in actual fact it was originally our idea, and I think it had an impact on that argument which wasn't expected. Can I say I thought you did really well in getting the manifesto together very quickly. You mentioned you'd had it signed and sealed by the 8th of May and came out on the 18th. I found it difficult as a parliamentary candidate being invited to a couple of hustings and having to wing it because I didn't really know what was in the manifesto, which is not normally the case in the past. And finally, the point I really put my hand up at the beginning was about the manifesto launched. I watched it on the TV. It was held in a club with a whole load of youngsters screaming and waving. But it didn't look right. And I watched Tim continually looking up to the auto cue, and it made him look shifty. And it was not a presentation I expected of a serious document. It looked like a club and a lot of people having a good time and listening to a good rallying speech. It was not the opening remarks of a manifesto. When you look at Tim's response after the election in the National Liberal Club, looking very sober, that was much better. And I think we've got to get it right. So when we're launching a manifesto, we need to take it seriously. And we need to make sure our leader takes it seriously and the presentation is serious. And I'm sure that was a mistake because it didn't look right to me. And I think it didn't help us look at like a serious party. From the beginning, we launched the manifesto in the media.
Thank you. Lady over here.
Hi, Karen Wilkinson. I was a candidate in Kingswood where we upheld the tradition of losing our deposit. I'm on the Lib Dem Education Association exec and the Education Policy Working Group. Outside the Lib Dems, I'm also a campaigner for the Parents' Union, specifically concentrating on term time attendance. I just would like to put a little plea in on actually including our policy from September 2015 to reverse the term time attendance regulations into the policy, because it's a very quick, easy win. It's an extremely popular issue. And post a Supreme Court ruling in April this year, we're seeing a lot of impact for children, especially those with educational difficulties and illness and disabilities. So it's a very popular issue with parents. Our education policy was great, but the School Cuts campaign and their website with the calculations on really detracted from that argument. It was very hard to differentiate ourselves from Labour, and this would have been one way in which we could have shown that we had something additional to say to Labour. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go for this side. There's a lady in a kind of orange cardigan over here with her hand up just on the block there, and a gentleman there with kind of beard and a white shirt just on this block up here. Yeah, if you just sort of keep your hand up until the stewards reach you. That'd be great.
I'm Margaret McNeil from Reading. I'm an art worker, and so my question is more on a practical level. I thought the messaging, especially on the NHS and education, in fact, most of the messaging was fantastic and translated very well onto focuses because you could distill really strong messages. But in order to get the free post leaflets out, the deadline for printing came before the manifesto did. And I do appreciate that obviously timing was extremely short, but it seemed the main message that was going into every household didn't have our main message. And in a constituency like Reading, we were relying on the free post to get our message across. And so I just wondered if there was any kind of way, any tactics or strategy available to have in mind some kind of key headlines for future manifestos in case another snap election is called, so that us poor art workers have a fighting chance of getting the messages into the leaflets.
Thank you very much. Yeah, gentleman here.
Thank you. I'm Ollie Henman. I was the PPC for East Worthing and Shoreham. I also wanted to talk about the education policy, which has already just been mentioned. In my experience on the doorstep, that went down very well, and I think it was extremely useful that we had such a well-costed education policy. And I think you mentioned there the IFS report and the fact that we also had the breakdown by region on how much more we would actually have in the pot for schools. That was very credible, that was very realistic, it gave people something very tangible, and I actually think it did differentiate us from Labour, because the way that Labour talked about it was very vague. We had some very, very specific areas, paying for it with corporation tax reverse. The other thing I would say linked to that was the free school meals, and that also played very well, and given that was our policy in the coalition, I think, again, we're able to really stake a claim in that area, and I think doing that kind of breakdown of policy really helps when we're talking to people on the doorstep. Thanks.
Thank you. Right, I'm just conscious of time. I'm going to take a couple more comments around health, education, families and communities. So I've got a gentleman here in a kind of puffer jacket, I think that's what it is, and somebody here with a very colourful patterned top and European beret. Fabulous.
Hugh Anand, I was the candidate for Hitchin and Harpenden, and I'm a veteran of various other parliamentary elections. The education, the extra money for education and schools in particular was a very easy sell. One of the most active groups on social media in my constituency was a group of parents. Education was the #1 issue. Of course, the Conservative candidate had big trouble on this because of his party's plans. So that was good. It was well presented, and it was enormously helpful to me to have that in there.
Thank you very much.
Heather Haller, Southwest Surrey. I want to build on the points about the costings in education and health and how the public would be expected to pay for these. We need this sort of information for the manifesto, not only in time for the free post, but for the free post to hit the doorsteps of people before the postal votes go out, because there's so many more people having postal votes. So we need to think of this. It's a really long lead time. And believe me, getting the artwork agreed by the Royal Mail and all the other things that need to go on mean that this activity needs to start very early.
Thank you very much. If your comment doesn't get taken, you do have something burning you want to add in, there is an email address in the agenda, policy.consultations@libdems.org.uk, so don't feel that you can't get your voice heard on this. I'm going to come over to the panel to pick up on any of the comments that were raised around health, education and families.
Well, actually, if you don't mind, the comment that wasn't about health or education but was about the launch deserves a quick comment as well. People think that there's huge levels of agreement and coordination between the parties in terms of the days that we launch our manifestos. That actually isn't the case. And there's an awful lot of bargaining and bartering going backwards and forwards, mostly conducted by who's got the best intelligence as to when somebody is actually launching their manifesto. We were very clear that we obviously want to have space to launch our manifesto on a particular day. And it was becoming increasingly clear that the Conservatives were doing as much as they could to muddy that pitch. But also, if you remember back to that time, there was there was a regular drumbeat of Corbynite rallies that were taking place. Now, we didn't have the resources available to us to answer that and the capability to put those sorts of things on. And a decision was deliberately taken to use the one shot that we were going to get in terms of manifesto launch to give some impetus and some momentum to our own manifesto launch. So whilst I appreciate that it was unlike other launches, it wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate intention to try and pick up the pace and to get us some movement behind our own position. Now, again, that may be the view that didn't work in this particular instance. It was extremely unfortunate, and you picked up on it, and I think everybody in the room at the time saw it, that the prompt monitor was hung way too high, and so that did result in the leader looking up for his prompts from a monitor that was just too high, and that was a logistical mistake that, in terms of production, that can be very easily addressed. I think there's the other issue that was raised about the communication of this. Again, some of this is down to the simple times constraints that we had and the ability that we had of the art working team centrally to provide those, if you like, manifesto highlights. But we were pumping out parts of that manifesto in advance as in a traditional format with a subject each day in the run-up to that launch in an attempt to get some interest in advance of the manifesto launch. And we probably could have used that more, if you like, in order to provide you with ready reckoner guides and some overarching themes for your own use. And I think that the message in both this section and the previous section is that we need to have those themes really clearly identified as messaging themes, which you can then hang off the manifesto policy commitments. And I think certainly that's a lesson that we can look at for next time round, when hopefully won't be a snap election. But in this instance, because it was a snap election and we were working under different time constraints, it didn't work, and there wasn't time for us to do it. But that doesn't mean it's not a good idea.
Thank you. No? Okay, we're going to move on to the next section now. So this is the economy and environment. So just a quick reminder. So boosting the economy through a major programme of capital investment, doubling innovation and research spending, and eliminate the government budget deficit, and only borrow to invest, and also cut air pollution, ban fracking, invest in renewable energy, and improve home insulation. So we're going to spend a few minutes discussing that. So if you could pop your hands up if you've got specific comments you want to make around those areas, that'd be fantastic. So I've got a gentleman here in kind of dark jacket and blue shirt, and over here I've got a gentleman in a white shirt. Yes. Oh no, sorry, not. There's a gentleman up on there. But if you hang on to your microphone, we'll come to you as well. We'll do all three. That's fine. You just wait a second.
Hello, I'm Stephen G. I was the candidate at Epsom Newell, and we didn't lose our deposit. I think the economy, probably surprisingly, didn't actually feature much in the election. And I think, sort of reflecting on what a lot of people have said, I think we started off with the right manifesto and we started off with the right message on Europe, but then the election itself shifted and changed, and Jeremy Corbyn did most of that shifting. The election became about austerity and about having properly funded NHS and schools, as we've talked about. And instead of dropping our main message, which I think we should have done, because everyone knows we're pro-Europe, we don't have to keep ramming it down their throats, to be perfectly honest. We should have concentrated on some of the very good messages we had in the manifesto and brought them up. And I didn't notice us changing our campaign at all as that went through. It didn't change when Tim was doing question time debates. He still hammered on about Europe and didn't start addressing, all the timing issues people talked about is true. The free post leaflet that went out, we all suffered with the same thing, which was, yes, there were some key messages there, but it did include a slag off of Jeremy Corbyn being terrible, no leadership. Once the election changed, we had to somehow or other shift our message and actually address those Leave supporters who, I believe, a lot of them voted Leave because their schools weren't properly funded, the NHS is not properly funded, and it was too easy to blame that on immigration and things they associated with Europe. We could have addressed that and said, no, it's because of governments not investing properly into those things. And we didn't shift that message well enough, I don't think.
Thank you. If we could keep comments a bit more tightly around economy and environment, I think that'd be really great, because if there are people with specific comments on that, and if we've missed the boat on your area, you can email the email address. Yes.
Hello. Richard Flowers, the candidate for Macclesfield. I agree with a lot of what was just said. I think the economy stuff was buried quite a long way down in the manifesto. I can understand why we did that, but it's a shame that because we were facing a Conservative Party with an economic policy that has clearly failed now, and a Labour Party with an economic policy which failed 40 years ago, we really should be in a position to develop a forward-looking 21st century economy. Now, I think actually that's something with Vince as leader we can really play to our strengths again, but we have some good policies in here. I like the entrepreneur scheme. We should be focusing more about how we are the small business party, how we help people, and also tying that into the green economy and saying, bring back those green jobs that the Conservatives just threw away straight after they won in 2015. We had a real opportunity. There was a lot of small businesses and medium-sized businesses that were really sent to the line because George Osborne threw out the green crap, and we could have said, look, we had an economy that was going to grow based on that, so we had a story to tell there, and we sort of buried it a bit.
Thank you very much. Yes, gentleman here.
Adolfo Sansolini, Islington. First of all, I'd like to thank Jeremy Corbyn, because last November, after 28 years, he convinced me to join a party again, this party. And I'm really grateful to him for having done that. I think on the environmental issues, I mean, like on other issues, we've been quite intellectual, we've been quite deep. And I mean, as a gay Christian, I totally agree with what Tim Farron was saying about not being a theocracy, but actually saying, no, I don't think it's a sin, let's move on, was the right thing to do. On the environmental policies, we didn't have much we could communicate. Well, we had a lot we could communicate. There wasn't a strong message. I drafted, working on animal welfare issues, a long response for our candidate, for people who were writing to him about, following appeals of some animal welfare organizations. I think we should have some standard replies. We have a lot to say. We are the party of animal welfare as well, but there was one line in the program about farm animal welfare, and we have a lot to say about the negative effects of Brexit on animal welfare, human rights, and so on. So say we can expand on that. We need snapshots. We need to understand that we haven't got much access to media. In the last 2 weeks of the electoral campaign, while initially we had people just saying, I don't usually vote for the Lib Dems, what else can we do? We totally disappeared. So actually, in a place like Islington, where we put out leaflets on the NHS, and then we totally disappeared, a lot of people there, in a place where Labour, and Labour is Thornbury and Corbyn, has North Korean percentages, people think that, okay, Labour is going to protect the NHS anyway. I think we need very simple Daily Mail, Daily Express, some messages people can understand, can eat their feelings, and actually tell the truth about the difference we can make in their lives. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm just very conscious of time. I'm going to take another couple of comments on economy and the environment. I've got a gentleman up there with a red jumper on, and sorry, a gentleman with kind of pattern t-shirt. If you just keep your hand up for a second, and actually I'll take one more. There's a lady down here with a kind of bob. If you just keep your hand up for a second until the microphone gets you, that'd be great. We'll start over here.
David Garlick from Northampton. We lost 2 deposits. We have fantastic environmental policies. I think the Friends of the Earth declared us as greener than the Greens and probably the most green party with their policies. We didn't shout about that. I mean, Brexit is the current issue. Climate is much more important than that. We really need to grab that agenda, and I think we failed to use the excellent stuff we got on environmental policy as much as we could have done. And I think there is scope to actually wake the population up to the problems that are coming down the line, and to the fact that we've got a handle on what needs to be done to help to alleviate and stop that happening.
Thank you very much. Gentleman here.
So, Jonathan Brown from Chichester. It was my first time standing, and I was really proud to do so on the manifesto. There was loads and loads of stuff in it. It felt coherent to me. However, I think as a party, lots of us, and I think most of us acknowledge this, we don't really know exactly why we're Liberal Democrats. It just feels right. And there wasn't really an overarching theme in the manifesto. Soak the rich and free unicorns for everyone worked for Labour, but change the future, but how or why or who are we trying to help? The environment, I always found loads and loads and loads of great policy, but I found it very difficult to remember exactly what it was and how it broke down and what were the priorities. And so I think the same was kind of true with our manifesto. What was the overall theme? And so finally, just to kind of backtrack a little bit, actually the Brexit message itself was flawed. Not because it was...
Are you sneaking back to the...
Well, so not because it was pro-Remain, but because it was the how will you deliver it? You want a referendum, but it's not. And again, this is not about being in opposition. It's if you get into government, why are you going to hold a referendum? What are you going to hold a referendum on? It was a policy we were asking other people to deliver. We didn't have a policy to deliver ourselves in government.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, the lady here.
I'm Claire Young. I was the candidate in Thornbury and Yate. I feel with the economy section in particular, but maybe this would apply to other parts of the document, that it's not the economy bit wasn't only tucked quite far down, but also it's written in a way that is very high level and difficult, I think, for people to relate to themselves as an individual. And if you can frame, when you're talking on the doorstep, you're talking to a person who has particular, you know, you might be talking to a small businessman or you know, maybe sort of, or an older person, and it would be helpful to have particularly the more impenetrable economic stuff framed in what it means for those people, because when you're talking, you're not talking about, you know, an economy that works for everyone sounds lovely, but it's all like, it doesn't mean anything to a particular person, and that's what I find. I think it applies particularly to economy. It probably applies to other things too, and it would actually be helpful in an election where you had more time to plan to think about framing other policies in this way. But I think the economy, because it is, people don't necessarily think about the economy as a whole. They think about how it affects them and their immediate family.
Thank you very much. Does the panel want to feedback on that at all? Pick up on any of those points?
Sure. I'll just do one comment. We don't have time to respond to every individual comment, obviously, but we are taking detailed notes, so thank you for all of that. Just want to respond on the environmental stuff, because that's my area. Obviously, I am keen to highlight our green message every time in the election, but the reality is that if you ask people what are the most important issues on which they cast their vote, environmental issues never feature very high. And generally speaking, journalists aren't terribly interested in covering them during the election. I mean, it was the whole topics of climate change and the environment were missing from the entire campaign. So we struggle against that. And what we've tried to do in the last two manifestos in particular is to try and integrate our environmental and our economic policy and go on about the value of investment in renewables, and particularly areas where the UK is strong, like offshore wind, for jobs and prosperity and exports and so on. And I think it's the right message, and we'll keep on hammering away at that. Picking up on one of the comments earlier, that does relate to what we did in coalition. And I think you're probably right, we have not entirely worked out how to cope with our legacy from coalition, partly because of the 2015 election, obviously. But one of the really strong areas, I think, for us there was climate change and energy policy. And I think we need to not forget that and need to make more of it, and I hope we will do that in the future. I'll just pass over to Sarah.
Yeah, the risk of being repetitive. Someone said everyone knows we're pro-EU, and therefore we shouldn't talk about that, we should talk about everything else. Well, two things there. First of all, even if everyone does know we're pro-EU, it's only because we keep repeating it. You know, when you've been united and consistent on something for 70 years, you don't sort of forget to mention it, because it's our USP. That you know, we don't chop and change on our pro-European convictions. But secondly, it does not mean that we don't talk about anything else. And I was just checking back on in the Europe chapter, for instance, we said that one of the main reasons for being in the EU is to be able to tackle, to protect our environment and tackle climate change together. That is absolutely true. And so many sort of global issues, we are sort of stronger when we are together with our European allies. And I totally take the point that a lot of people voted leave. In fact, more people probably voted leave because they were fed up with other things in their lives, whether it be money for schools or they couldn't get a GP's appointment or whatever. But, you know, our message is that all of that is going to get worse with Brexit, because there'll be less money and you could lose your job. So, you know, we're making that link as well. We're not just talking about Europe. We're talking about the effect on Brexit of people's daily lives in many aspects.
Just one frustration from the election and one challenge. On the economy and public expenditure, both the Tory manifesto and the Labour manifesto were clearly complete fantasy. And the IFS said in terms that neither of them could deliver what they proposed. And that wasn't the case with ours. And believe you me, we had huge, detailed discussion about saving the odd £100 million here so the figures added up and that kind of thing. But we were unable to punch through the fact that the other two parties had fantasy economics, because the journalists, it didn't fit it with their narrative. And it showed to me how much we were sort of priority takers from the media, rather than priority setters. But the challenge, which I pick up from the candidate from Thornbury and Yates about how you make all this stuff relevant, was born in me. I was going to do a TV programme, and the taxi driver, the minicab driver, said to me on the way there, as an Asian man, he said, Liberal Democrats frown. So he said, what are you going to do for me? And I don't think I had ever thought, I'd ever had that question in my mind during the entire manifesto process. It's not the way we think about it, but I think it's the way we should think about it.
Thank you very much. We're going to shift on some of the final sections now around rights, justice and equalities, international and political and constitutional reform. So as a quick reminder, this is increasing community policing, spending an extra 300 million a year on the police, and opposing the move to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. Also continuing to spend 0.7 GMP on aid, suspending arms sales to Saudi Arabia, and introducing PR for national local elections and giving 16, 17-year-olds the right to vote. 7-year-olds could be a bit of a worry. So if we could pop our hands up again, if I really want it to keep on point because we are running low on time, so it really has to be on these issues. That'd be fantastic. So I've got a gentleman here in a dark jacket, blue shirt, and I've got a lady at the front here in a kind of shawl, and I've got a gentleman here in a taupe jacket. If you just keep your hand up until the microphone gets to you, and this lady here with a shawl at the front.
Okay. Nick Wakeling, Islington. I want to talk about cannabis. Personally, I'm in favour of legalising it, but I think it comes across very badly. I think it undermines our credibility as a grown-up political party. Sorry to say that, but I think we need to sometimes moderate our purist beliefs with pragmatic impact on the electorate. If we do have to run with that line, I think we need to tie it with something a little bit more concrete. I get the health slant, but I think something around, say, if we were to legalise and regulate cannabis, then we would, and these facts are true on, I think, we would save about 300 million for the criminal justice system, and 900,000 would be generated 900 million would be generated in tax revenues, and that could help close the health deficit of about 2 billion this year. I think something like that actually makes it more real, relevant, pragmatic, and impactful in people's lives.
Thank you. Lady here.
I don't know how maybe the message can go across. I just want to concentrate on something that has been said at the last commentator. There's something about the message. Generally, it does not resonate with either people from the ethnic minority. It's like they don't exist. I got the church hierarchy negates Liberal Democrats, and yet it's justice and fairness that we're about, trust. A lot of people working with asylum seekers are being led by Liberal Democrats, activists in the community. All that good work that we do, Labour reap the rewards because they then position themselves and just there on the day, but they don't do the groundwork. How can we, at a strategic level, maybe talk to, Bishop Welby, talk to the big people so that they actually do hear our voice as well, and actually translate our voice, because to them it's about Labour and the Tories. They're trying to talk to the congregation to say, vote Labour, because they can't see how else we can go through. So it's about the message, and I know from black people and from Europeans, I come from Camden, Nancy Girera, I was a councillor in Camden. However, I got friends in the NHS who are saying to me, Liberal Democrats are not coming out enough to tell us whether we can vote in the next election. We need to be seen to be the people that encourage. People are frightened to even think that they can vote in the local elections. So something needs to be done for the message to come out, for fairness, for justice, and for the amount of work that people are doing in the Liberal Democrats with asylum seekers.
Thank you. What was your name, sorry?
Nancy Girera from Camden.
Thank you very much. Gentleman over here.
Tony Vickers, I was the agent in Newbury where we increased our vote. But I think we've got to steal a really good campaign slogan from the Leave campaign, which is take back control. Now, we know that leaving the EU is not going to give back people control over their lives, but is, to me, a fundamental part of our values, that we want to give power to the people. That was the best slogan this party's ever had for an election, and I think we should use it again. And, you know, following on from that lady said, people feel they've lost control over their lives, that the world is spinning away from them, and we've got to give people back hope. Now, we know our hard-working councillors at every level go out and act as advocates, and although powers have stripped off local government, we are fighting for powers to be devolved down to individuals at the same time as saving the world through cooperating with other nations in the world. So that slogan, never mind a manifesto, that's got to be what we stand for.
Thank you. I'm going to take 3 more comments from the floor on this one. So Robert, down here. I've got, there's a gentleman up here, he's leaning over. I think you've got some kind of hoodie on or something. Yes, you keep your hand up for a second. And if you come over to this side, there's a gentleman here in a kind of grey shirt. If you just keep your hand up, just keep your hand up for a second, just while the microphone finds you, that'd be great. Okay. Right. I can't remember who I started with now. Robert.
Okay.
Robert.
I think that one revolutionary thought I've had during this discussion is that the manifesto seems to come out as a statement of our policies and things like that, and seems to be a surprise that this is a new document, a new statement of our new policies and things like that. But it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. We should have been releasing these manifesto commitments on a drip, drip, drip basis over 5 years before the election. You know, our principles have not changed. The details may need to be tied down in the manifesto, but the principles are there.
Thank you very much. You've got the gentleman up here with the hoodie.
John Grout from Reading. One thing I've been thinking about during this is that there's been lots of comment about how good these policies are, and I think that's particularly true for the criminal justice stuff, and the gentleman down there was talking about cannabis legalisation. I think his point was very good. But one thing Jo Swinson said the other day in her speech was that there was this question you could ask predicting how people were going to vote on various things, including Brexit, about whether they wanted their children to be, considerate or well-behaved. And while virtually everyone in the hall said they wanted their kids to be considerate, we do need to remember that we need to talk to the people who said their kids would want to be well-behaved, the sort of the strict type people. And I think we really missed a trick with the criminal justice system, in particular, our policies on that, because actually a lot of our policies could actually really appeal to them if they were framed in the right way. And the gentleman who was talking about how we needed to take the take back control slogan, actually I don't think that's quite right. The Liberal Democrats don't want to take back control. The Liberal Democrats want to give you control. And I think that's a point that could possibly help appeal to those people who want the sort of slightly stricter approach that has so often been anathema to the Lib Dems in the past.
Thank you very much. Gentleman here in the middle.
Oh, hello. I'm Philip Mackin from Southampton. I just wanted to comment on the right promoting justice and equality section. Compared to all the others, that was really the most unsatisfactory one to me, because it felt like it was so many disparate topics that had just been lumped together, you know, like civil rights and drugs and prison reform, and especially immigration, because it's such a big topic for other parties, and we find them making the argument that conflates economic versus refugee migration, that actually I'd want more space devoted to that in ours, just so that we can refute those arguments front and centre before we then go on to explain what our programme of government is.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come back to the panel now just to make any comments, if you want to pick up any of the comments that came from that before we move on to the final section. Did you want to pick up? You don't have to.
Can I just, while I remember that last question, I will refute the conflating immigration and asylum. I think if you look at pages 77 and 78 of the manifesto, and I remember, and I think I was one of those who talked at the FPC on this, we are very clear in separating immigration and asylum and refugee rights for, I think, the right reasons. I mean, I think, I just, the issue about giving control and people who like order, I mean, I think there may be a good point there about how we present our policies on for instance, on reform of the criminal justice system, on reform of drugs laws. I mean, it may be, maybe partly because of space, that we didn't perhaps put up as near the front as we should have done on reforming laws on cannabis, that how much, but we did talk about how that would reduce crime if you legalise, and maybe we should have put more about how much money you can raise and so on. But I think we do send the order as well as the consideration messages. After all, we are liberals, we're not anarchists. And I think a lot of what we say, which sometimes is distorted by, you know, the Daily Mail or something, as being typical softy liberals, we perhaps need to get a little bit better at conveying how important it is. Because if you reform prisons, you're hoping for fewer criminals in future. That, you know, less repeat offenders. We're trying to reduce crime. It's not only about being decent and having humane systems in prison. We want to educate people so that they'll get out of a life of crime, and so on and so on. And maybe we haven't as well as we could drawn those messages out.
Can I just say something about the cannabis situation? The media people decided, and this gets back to something that a number of people raised, why didn't we drip feed initiatives? We did drip feed policies on a day-by-day basis running up to the launch of the manifesto, and we did a very successful launch of our schools policy and putting more money into schools, for example, where we did get a lot of good coverage. A decision was taken that we would put out the policy on cannabis a week before the launch of the manifesto as a whole, so as on the launch day, the coverage of our manifesto wouldn't be dominated by cannabis, which was always seen to be one of those, frankly, second-order issues in terms of people's priorities, but one that the media loves talking about. In my view, it was a very understandable decision, but a wrong decision, because not only did we spend one day, week before the manifesto, talking about it, but on manifesto day, when I did for example, the BBC regional radio programmes, the GNS round, they're all given the similar script about what our priorities were, and there were only 3 things which they chose to mention, one of which was cannabis. If we had not drawn attention to it, I doubt whether that would have been one of the 3 things. And unfortunately, it plays into the narrative that the media love, that we're a rather wacky lot. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. But that is an easy narrative, and we need to be aware of it. Our manifesto contained a number of quite interesting policies, and I was frankly quite relieved not to have to suffer intense interrogation on our policy around prostitution. But not a single question was raised about that, and the single main reason, I think, was that we hadn't raised it ourselves, whereas we had with cannabis.
I'm just going to... I have a slight... there's a disconnect in the force here. You, conference, vote for this policy. If you don't like the policy and you don't like it being repeated back to you, don't vote for it. It goes into the manifesto, and I'm not shirking my responsibility for it, I'm being honest with you here. And it goes into the manifesto, and then it's up to your communicators as to how they deal with it. We can either decide that your decision is not the one that we would like, and we will junk it from the manifesto, and you can complain that it's not in the manifesto. Or it can go in the manifesto, and we can basically face it up as a proper, sensible, grown-up policy that it indeed is. And I think the point, I think, sorry, was it Nick that raised this? Julian Huppert did a hell of a lot of work on this policy, and it did do exactly the points that you raised. It made it a criminal justice issue. It talked about the revenue that it would raise legitimately for taxation, and it talked about all the other many things in terms of benefits for social and health reasons that it would have. You know, none of those are reported because those aren't the things that Dick said make us look wild and wacky. And I think probably in retrospect we would have had that as a manifesto issue either way. We probably made it easier by trying to take the sting out of it in advance. But you know, that's something that we've had to live with, and we can not do it again, if you like, or you can decide that you want something else in a manifesto. The quick, actually, issue that Nancy raised, which I think it is something that really does worry me, and it should worry us all, about the communication with black and ethnic minority communities about our manifesto principles, whatever they are. And that is something that we really need to put some thinking into, because in my experience, I'm from Southwark, and that there isn't a campaigner more assiduous in his treatment of the religious communities right across the spectrum in his seats. Simon Hughes went to every church and every place he possibly could to put out the party's views and to make himself accessible to those communities. It didn't result in a beneficial result of itself. Now, that indicates to me that there was something bigger and more wider than simply engaging. It is about how we engage and what we engage with and the regularity with which we do it across a range of communities which may not be, frankly, our parliamentary target seats, but which actually lead communities in their reaction to us across the board. And that's something that we do have to address, manifesto or not.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on to the section about manifesto costings, and I'm going to add in here, this is also a place to put some more of your comments around how you felt it landed, you know, the tools that you had, etc., what you felt you maybe needed more of. I know we've touched on it a little bit at the beginning. I think if there are people who want to come in at this stage, this is probably a good time for you to do it. So in particular around the costings of the manifesto, raising income tax and corporation tax to provide resources for health and education, borrowing for capital investment, increasing public spending roughly in time with growth of the economy. So I'm going to go to the floor. I've got a gentleman down here with a blue shirt on, and I've got a gentleman up here with a grey jacket and a blue shirt on, and a gentleman here with kind of brown jumper and shorts. A lovely flash of legs from the middle there. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hello, Stephen Crozier from Camden. I was the PPC for Holborn and St Pancras. The economic and the costings were absolutely fantastic. To have the Institute of Fiscal Studies and others saying that they were the best costed and credible of any of the three main parties was a real benefit when you could get the opportunity to talk about it. I think it should have been much higher up our agenda. I did find that we just got lost, the health and the education got lost. We just looked like Labour light. Talking about the manifesto more generally, I think we have a propensity to talk about ourselves in relationship to the Tories and Labour. And if you read the preamble of the manifesto, it's all talking about Labour and Conservatives and not about us. And what we did. And I think something we fail consistently to do is at the top of every bit of literature say what Liberal Democrats stand for, you know, what it means to be a Liberal Democrat. And that message has been lost for, you know, a decade or so. No one really knows what the core values of Liberal Democrats are out in the public. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentleman up here in the corner.
Yes, hello, my name's Paul Fisher. I represent Lib Dems in Europe. And I want to focus on two words which can be misstrued. Value proposition, and it really refers to the minicab driver that Lord Newby mentioned. What is the value proposition that we are putting to our electorate? It's what is the imperative to buy our proposition? And I think that is summed up with what Lord Newby said. But I think that if he didn't know what that process was to derive a value proposition, then that is an underpinning reason for many of the comments in the hall. What is the eye-catching one-liner that makes you buy the manifesto? And I think that sometimes comes across in the costing section, but it also across the other sections as well.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman in the middle section here.
Yes, I underlined those two previous points as well. Dick got the point earlier that his taxi driver asked him, what does this mean for me? A lot of the criticism we have placed at ourselves over this last few days about why we didn't do well is we didn't communicate what we stand for. Answering your message, Dick, what does this manifesto do for me, is describing what we stand for. So as well as all the policies that we put in the manifesto, and I'm happy with them, almost all of them, we need those punchlines about what this means for you.
Thank you very much. Right, I've got a lady here with kind of orangey jacket, cardigan over here. I've got a gentleman here in the front row with a kind of checked green shirt as well.
I'm Jennifer Ware and I'm from Kensington and Chelsea. I do believe that people vote on issues, what thing, something do for me, an issue more or less of the moment, rather than our overall values, etc. They're very important, they're the backup. Are we on the ball to pick up what is people's immediate greatest worry? Now, I believe in the last election, this last election, people's greatest worry actually was the National Health Service. National Health Service idiot, National Health Service. Now, that did not really come across with enough punch. And if it had, I think we would have done very much better, because we were very much, we created the National Health Service, but it did not come through that we were the ones who really would give them a better National Health Service. I mean, if there was an election tomorrow, for instance, next week, if we had a headline, we will get hold of Jeremy Hunt and give it back to you all in little pieces, I think we would probably, we get the headlines, but we would certainly, and if it was metaphoric, of course, we would also win a lot of votes.
Thank you very much.
Be immediate, that's what I'm saying.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Julian Heathers from Lambeth. I think actually it's a shame that we didn't use the 2015 slogan instead of the Change Britain's Future. Change Britain's future for what? For the worse or for the better? But the slogan, stronger economy and a fairer society, I think sort of sums up where we are, because you can't trust Labour on the economy and basically the Tories don't care. And I think that tells us where we are. It differentiates us from the other parties, and it's just a shame we couldn't have used that slogan again. Recycling is a very good thing. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Right, I've got a lady right in the middle with very long hair and kind of collar and black jumper. If you just keep your hand up for a second. Yeah, there's a gentleman just over here towards the back of this block with kind of brownie jumper on. Just keep your hand up for a second.
Hi, my name is Ruby and I'm from Arran. There are just a few things I want to talk about, which is that I think we actually have a lot of radical policies that people would like, and we're simply not radical enough in our manifesto. For example, regarding NHS, yes, we talk about the 1% tax rise to fund mental health, etc., but we have got no single message about delivering healthcare and how an end-of-life care and healthcare for older people and euthanasia. These are, our population is getting older. Dementia is getting more popular, and people want control in how they want to end their lives, how they want, and this has actually overwhelming support. I just did some research actually today. 82% of the public actually support legalizing or decriminalizing euthanasia, including 79% of religious people. And I don't understand, this is one of these radical liberal policies that we can push on, and I just don't understand why the party makes zero mention of this, despite an aging population being a serious issue, and despite whenever even Daily Mail comes up with articles about end-of-life care that no one, and there's overwhelming support even with the conservative circles, that we simply don't pick up on it. I'm sure this will resonate with a lot of people. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruby. Gentleman down here.
Yeah. Malcolm Mitchell from Ipswich constituency. To what extent did your priorities for the next Parliament will be changed during your consultations for producing the manifesto? Could those have gone out to the constituents at the beginning so that we could have got our messages out before the postal votes were sent out?
Thank you very much. Right, I'm going to take a last handful of comments, and we're going to come back to the panel just to sort of round everything up. There's a lady here in red. I've got a lady with a green waistcoat here. And I've got a gentleman with a kind of jacket and shirt up there. Just keep your hand up until the microphone gets to you. That'd be great. Lady down here.
Jenny Pinkett from Tamworth. I missed the beginning of the discussion, but I wanted specifically to talk about integrated policy. And I think probably the appropriate moment to bring it up is under costings. What I found very useful, I believe it was the 2005 manifesto, the one that was on newspaper and had a green thread running through every policy, was the fact that I could link one policy to another quite easily. It went down well with the public. Now I think we don't successfully do that. For example, going back to the cannabis, if we'd link cannabis with health issues, education, how much that actually costs, there's a very clear message there. There's some threads in it that are, that showing signs of integrated policy. But for example, in our local campaigning now, we are linking everything that we're campaigning on in housing with the environment, the economy, the transport system, so that we're very, very clear about exactly what the impact of Liberal Democrat policy will be in all those major aspects of people's lives. I think it probably could be done in that mini book. I mean, I'm not talking about extensive integrated policy, but some hint of it, of why we're doing this, for, in the economic section, why we're doing this under the policing section, why we're doing this in the healthing section, and link them.
Thank you very much. Yes, lady in the kind of green waistcoat there.
Catherine Pinder of Cumbria. I'm really loved the manifesto, and I really do congratulate the team that produced it, because I found when I opened it I was absolutely delighted to find so many solid policies that I knew vaguely about, well spelt out. And I really could not agree with an early comment of the elephant in the room on Brexit. As our lady, I'm sorry I don't know your name, said, Brexit brings so much more in about other policies, and it is our flagship policy. We did need to lead on that, and I'm so glad that you did. And I also can't agree that we should have focused on anything like the National Health Service, because I went to help Andrew George in St Ives, and there I found him writing a letter that sort of said, I don't want much to do with central policy. What matters here is the NHS. Well, Andrew George did not win, though he came close. And I think you got the balance right, and this gave us a lot of things that we could very well draw on and use usefully in our campaigns. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gentleman up here.
Chris Brown, I was the candidate in South Norfolk, where we kept our deposit and increased our share of the vote. I can't agree more with the lady there. The manifesto was great, had some really positive messages, lots of great detail that we could use at hustings or to talk to people who are really engaged and interested. but we have to face facts. 93% of people didn't vote for us. Most of them don't know who we are, don't know what we stand for, don't understand our values. We need just 3 or 4 simple statements that get cut through, and we just need to keep banging on 3 or 4 statements throughout the campaign so that more of those 93% of people know who we are, know what our values are, and could say, oh, they're the party of Remain. Oh, that's their policy on health and education. And that's it. That's what we need to just concentrate on day after day.
Thank you very much. Right, I am going to have to move back to the panel because we've only got a couple of minutes left of this session. If you didn't get your point in, again, there is an email address in here that you can send your feedback to, policy.consultations@libdems.org.uk. So I'm going to come over to the panel for any feedback on the comments that you've had today.
Utterly take the point of the challenge to convey our message in simple, striking bullets. You know, it is, there are some enduring commitments and values that we have, but circumstances change. So you can't just, I heard James mutter, we could just produce the same manifesto every time, would anyone notice? Which is an interesting thought. But we have to do 2 things. We have to keep emphasising those principles. We are pro-European. And if this party ever becomes not pro-European, I'm leaving. We are pro-human rights. We are pro-equal opportunities. We are pro-environmental protection. And so, you know, those are enduring. Those are in our DNA. But then there's also addressing the current context. So trying to get the balance right between those 2 things is the challenge, and it's useful to and thank you very much for all the thought-provoking comments that have been made and the challenge to us for the future, if I'm still on the FBC.
I think the point about values is a very good one, because there's nothing there is no overarching statement of values in the manifesto, and obviously people don't read the manifesto in huge numbers from cover to cover, but I think it would have benefited from it. I think now, given where we are, it's even more important that new people coming to the party, over Europe principally, need more by way of explanation of how that fits in with being liberal with a small l, and why liberal values are what motivate us into politics. And at a time when, by common consent, society is getting more liberal in this country, it may not be, maybe going backwards, as it were, in some other parts of the world, the fact that many, many people who are liberal do not vote Lib Dem because they don't realise that they're the same kind of liberals as we are, is actually quite an indictment to us all. Because everybody in the room is putting out focus leaflets, and I wonder how many people ever even have as much as a paragraph in any focus leaflet about what being liberal means.
And I think that's a very good challenge to begin to wind up on. And Jenny mentioned the 2005 manifesto, and we did refer to it earlier on as being a different format of a manifesto. And you mentioned that you reminded us of the linkage that we had on green policies that brought those things together. Those are really, you know, they're very good ideas, and they fit with the 3 messages and ram home with them time after time. And they are something that we can do with a bit more time. But in this instance, and they're very good points for the longer period. But for the snap election, I'm afraid it simply was one of those things that wasn't possible, even if we had you know, had that as a priority to do. So I think there's really good points. We can take them on board, and I'm sure we'll look at doing it a different way. And at that point, I'll hand over. And by the way, you can all look out for future manifestos. I promise you they won't be the same as we've always had. And the Corn Laws are well and truly repealed, so you don't need to sort of see them in any future manifestos, as Duncan pointed out to me. So, Duncan.
Thanks very much. Haven't got land value taxation yet, though. I think it is, Robert Adamson made the point this manifesto shouldn't come as a surprise, and that is always our aim in FBC, and that's the purpose of the manifesto process as we would like to run it, as I explained at the beginning. We start 2 years out from the election. Sometimes we have a short manifesto themes document that goes to conference and is consulted on and is debated, and then the next year we have a pre-manifesto document that's a bit more detailed and has main messages in and is consulted over and is debated, and then we have the manifesto. And that all works really well, and then I think that works well to make sure that the manifesto does not come as a surprise to our own people. It always works well, of course, when we know when the election is going to be. And we would run that system very well had the election been in 2020, not in June 2017. But assuming that we can roughly work out when the next election is going to be, that's what we'll do in the run-up to the next election. So there will be a much more long-term process. I think we've pretty much demonstrated in this session that we do need a certain level of detail in the manifesto. The people who care about animal welfare would scream if there wasn't any mention at all in the manifesto. I think maybe one line's about the right amount. Friends of the Earth and analysing our environmental commitments go through comparing what we say and the other parties say against a list of about, I think they have about 20 priorities. So we do need that, but that's not incompatible with having the main messages which the campaign focuses on and which we hammer on again and again and again over a period of years. I would just say it's not that easy to come up with those, and particularly to make sure they are distinctive to us and not to the others. Just to finish then, I think the sort of discussion we got into at the end about promoting realisation of, encouragement, discussion of, and education in party values and what we stand for and how those values are translated into policy is very important, and we are hoping to focus more on that on FBC in the coming years. I just recommend 2 pocket guides to you that you can purchase for only 50p each from the Lib Dem image stand. One on Lib Dem policy, it's just a summary of Lib Dem policy points, chapter by chapter. And the other one is on the Liberal Democrat approach, where our beliefs and our values stem from. Now, they're not designed to be used in the manifesto, it's a kind of narrative, but it is designed to get people thinking. It may be something you want to perhaps give or encourage to your new members and get local party discussions around. The Your Liberal Britain initiative, which is promoting the idea of a party vision, is kind of coming at the same thing from a different way, and we're working with them on FBC and very happy to. So we will try and do our best to do that in the future, and we're certainly open to new ideas from you. And so I just finished by saying I think the session's been really valuable. Thank you very much to everyone who's commented. Please send in emails, those who didn't get a chance, and I hope we will be able to run the session again after next and hopefully much more successful elections.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Right, before you all shoot out the hall, I would very much like to pass on my thanks to Dick Newby, to Sarah Ludford, James Girling and Duncan Brack and their teams and the committees who worked on the manifesto. They did an enormous power of work, as you know, in a very short space of time. So I would like to express my appreciation to you guys as well, not just for being here and taking questions. So thank you. And before you all scoot out the hall, I know many of you may be heading to Glee Club tonight. It is in fact at 10 p.m, not 9:30 p.m, although you may be very keen and want to get there very early. And can I thank my aide, Paul Tilsley, and my aide in the hall, Andrew Wiseman. Thank you very much and have a good evening.